There are lives that move quietly through their time, touching the world in ways that remain hidden for decades. Alan Matheson. Turing lived such a life. Born in an age of empire, coming of age between two wars, he worked in shadows and spoke a language most could not understand. He thought in symbols and machines, in questions that had no names yet. His work would help save millions of lives, though few would know his name while he lived. His ideas would build the foundation of a new age, though he would not live to see it fully arrive. This is the story of a mathematician who saw patterns where others saw chaos, who built machines from pure thought, who asked if a machine could think and then showed the world how to begin answering. It is the story of a man who helped win a war in secret, who imagined a future we now inhabit, and who was broken by the very world he helped to save. The narrative unfolds slowly, from a childhood in the England of the early 20th century, through the urgent quiet of wartime intelligence, into the dawn of the computer age, and finally to a small house in Cheshire where a life ended too soon. There is no hurry in this telling. The facts remain, patient and still, waiting to be remembered. If you find peace in this story, consider leaving a like on this video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing in the comments where in the world you're listening tonight. The story asks for nothing but attention, offered gently, and withdrawn when sleep arrives. Now, to the beginning, to a house in London, and a child born into a world that did not yet know what it would need from him. Chapter 1. London's Edge, 1912. Alan Matheson Turing was born on June 23, 1912, in a nursing home in Paddington, London. The place was called Warrington Lodge, a respectable establishment for middle-class families who required medical care or assistance with childbirth. His father, Julius Matheson Turing, served in the Indian Civil Service, stationed far from England in the administration of the British Raj. His mother, Ethel Sarah Stoney, had returned to England for the birth. As was customary for families of the colonial service, she would deliver her second son in the safety and familiarity of home, even if home meant temporary lodgings and separation from her husband. The Turing family belonged to that broad middle tier of British society that served the empire without great wealth or aristocratic connection. Julius Turing had been educated at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, though without particular distinction. He passed the examination for the Indian Civil Service and spent most of his working life in Madras, in the southern reaches of India, administering districts and managing the details of colonial governance. It was respectable work, steady and honourable, but it meant long years abroad and periodic separations from family. Ethel Stoney came from a family with a modest scientific heritage. Her father, Edward Waller Stoney, had been chief engineer of the Madras Railways. Her own interests lay in painting and literature, pursuits that occupied her during the long months in India and the longer months apart from her husband when she returned to England with the children. She was a woman of determined independence, capable and strong-willed, raising her sons largely alone while her husband fulfilled his duties thousands of miles away. Alan had an older brother, John, born in India 2 years before. The brothers would grow up together but not close. John was conventional, sociable, inclined toward the expectations of their class. Alan, even from his earliest years, was different. He noticed things others overlooked. He asked questions that had no easy answers. He moved through childhood with a quiet intensity that marked him as strange to those who did not understand. The England of 1912 was at the height of its imperial confidence, though shadows were already forming at the edges. The great cities hummed with industry and ambition. The empire stretched across a quarter of the globe, but in the parlours and country houses, among those who paid attention, there was talk of tensions on the continent, of alliances and arms races, of a fragile peace that might not hold. Alan Turing was born into the last calm summer before the world broke apart. His infancy passed in London, and then in the English countryside, in temporary homes arranged by his mother. Julius Turing returned to England on leave when he could, but the pattern was set early. The family would not live together for long stretches. Ethel and the boys would remain in England for the children's education and health, while Julius continued his service in India. This separation shaped Alan's childhood. He grew accustomed to his father's absence, to the routines maintained by his mother, to a world where the adult who knew him best was a woman of formidable will and limited patience for strangeness. In 1914, when Alan was 2 years old, the Great War began. The world that had seemed so solid fractured. Millions of men marched to the trenches. The certainties of the Victorian age collapsed into mud and barbed wire. But for a small child in England, far from the front, the war was distant noise, a background hum of adult worry and absent fathers and hushed conversations. Alan's world was narrower, contained within the walls of rented houses and the gardens where he played. He noticed insects and leaves, the way light moved through water, the patterns in wallpaper and the shapes of numbers his mother wrote in her letters. The war ended in 1918. Alan was 6 years old. His father returned from India on leave, a stranger in uniform who brought stories and authority and then departed again. The pattern of separation continued. Alan and John were enrolled in day schools, then sent to live with a retired army couple, Colonel and Mrs. Ward, in the seaside town of St. Leonards-on-Sea. Their mother returned to India to be with their father. The boys were left in England, as was customary, to be educated in English schools and raised in English soil. Alan did not protest this arrangement. He accepted it as children accept the incomprehensible decisions of adults. But he retreated inward. He found comfort in solitary pursuits, in puzzles and problems, in the logic of numbers and the mysteries of how things worked. He was a boy who took apart toys to see their mechanisms, who drew maps of imaginary places, who could spend hours watching ants move across a path. He was not unhappy, but he was alone in a way that would never entirely leave him. The coastline of St. Leonards stretched grey and steady beneath English skies. The tides came and went with perfect regularity. Alan watched them, measuring their predictability, finding peace in patterns. The world might be vast and strange and full of absence, but mathematics was always there, unchanging, reliable, true. In numbers, there was no separation, no confusion, no need to explain oneself. There was only the elegance of proof, the certainty of logic, the quiet beauty of problems waiting to be solved. These early years set the foundation. They shaped a mind that would seek order in chaos, that would trust symbols more than words, that would build machines to think, because thinking, for Alan Turing, was the most natural and most solitary act in the world. Chapter 2. A boy apart. The years with Colonel and Mrs. Ward passed in routine and quietness. St. Leonards-on-Sea was a town of retired military families and modest boarding houses, a place where the sea wind carried salt and the streets ran orderly and clean. Alan attended Hazelhurst Preparatory School, a local establishment for boys of his class. He was not a model student. His handwriting was poor, his attention wandered, and he showed little interest in the classical curriculum that dominated English education. Latin and Greek held no appeal. He struggled with language, with the arbitrary rules of grammar and spelling, with the expectation that he should memorize and recite without understanding why. But in mathematics, he excelled. Numbers made sense to him in a way that words did not. He could see patterns, connections, the hidden structure beneath problems that baffled other boys. His teachers noticed this facility but were often frustrated by his methods. He did not follow the prescribed steps. He arrived at answers through intuition and leaps of logic that he could not always explain. He seemed to reinvent mathematics for himself, as if the textbooks were merely suggestions rather than authority. Outside of school, Alan roamed the countryside and the beaches. He collected stones and shells, examined plants, watched birds. He had a naturalist's eye for detail and a scientist's instinct for classification. He kept notebooks filled with observations, drawings, lists. He was learning to see the world as a system of patterns, each thing connected to every other thing through rules that could, with patience and thought, be discovered. His brother John was different. John was sociable, athletic, comfortable with the expectations of school and society. The brothers were not close. They occupied separate worlds even when they shared the same house. John went where boys were expected to go, did what boys were expected to do. Alan went his own way, quiet and self-contained. Not rebellious, but simply elsewhere, living in his thoughts. In 1926, when Alan was 13, his parents arranged for him to attend Sherborne School, a public school in Dorset with a long history and a reputation for producing officers and gentlemen. It was the natural next step for a boy of his background. John was already there, settled and successful. Alan would follow. But the transition was not smooth. The term was set to begin in early May. Alan was to travel by train from St. Leonard's to Sherborne, a journey of some distance across southern England. But in the days before term began, a general strike paralysed the country. The trade unions called out workers in support of the coal miners. Trains stopped running. The nation held its breath, uncertain whether this was the prelude to revolution or merely a labour dispute that would pass. Alan Turing, 13 years old, determined to reach Sherborne on time. He studied maps. He calculated distances. He found a bicycle and set out alone, riding more than 60 miles across unfamiliar roads to reach the school before term began. He slept one night at an inn, then continued the next day, arriving tired but triumphant. The local newspaper noted the journey, praising the boy's determination and resourcefulness. It was a small thing, a boy on a bicycle, but it revealed something essential about Alan Turing. When he set himself a problem, he solved it. He did not wait for permission or assistance. He did not complain about obstacles. He simply worked out the steps required and carried them through. This quality, this stubborn independence and refusal to be stopped by mere inconvenience, would define his life. Sherborne, however, did not celebrate such independence. The school prized conformity, discipline, classical learning, and athletic prowess. It trained boys to serve the empire, to lead without questioning too much, to fit into the roles assigned by class and tradition. Alan Turing fit into none of these expectations. His handwriting remained atrocious. His essays were disorganized. He showed no interest in sports or school spirit. He spent his free time in his room, working through advanced mathematics textbooks, or wandering the grounds alone, lost in thought. His housemaster, a man named Geoffrey O'Hanlon, despaired of him. In reports sent to Alan's parents, O'Hanlon wrote that the boy was wasting his time, that his obsession with mathematics and science was unseemly for a boy who should be developing into a well-rounded gentleman. Alan, the housemaster warned, would never achieve anything of note if he continued on this narrow path. He needed to broaden his interests, to conform, to become like the other boys. Alan ignored these judgments. He continued to work on problems that interested him, whether they appeared in the curriculum or not. He read Einstein's papers on relativity. He taught himself advanced calculus. He thought about infinity and continuity and the nature of numbers themselves. School was an interruption, a place he had to endure while his real education continued in private. He was lonely at Sherborne, but loneliness was not new. He had been alone most of his life. He did not expect companionship or understanding. He expected only to be left to his work, to the silent conversation he carried on with mathematics, that language that spoke of truth without ambiguity, of beauty without sentiment, of order beneath the chaos of the world. The sea wind blew across Dorset and the seasons turned. Alan Turing endured Sherborne because there was no alternative, but he was already elsewhere, living in a future only he could see, solving problems that did not yet have names. Chapter 3. Sherborne and Solitude. The years at Sherborne unfolded slowly, marked by term times and holidays, by the rhythms of chapel services and cricket matches and Latin declensions that Alan Turing learned without caring. He moved through the school like a ghost, present but not participating, visible but not understood. The other boys found him odd. He spoke little, and when he did speak it was often about subjects that baffled or bored them. He had no small talk, no easy charm. He could not pretend interest in things that did not interest him. His academic record was uneven. In mathematics and science he was brilliant, far ahead of his classmates, and often ahead of his teachers. He devoured textbooks and worked through problems that were not assigned, pursuing questions that arose from his own curiosity. But in subjects deemed essential by the school, classics, history, English composition, he remained stubbornly mediocre. His essays were poorly organised, his spelling erratic, his arguments difficult to follow, because he assumed knowledge his readers did not possess. He wrote the way he thought, in leaps and connections that made perfect sense to him and little sense to anyone else. His teachers were divided in their opinions. Some recognised his unusual gifts and tried to encourage him, offering him harder problems, lending him books, allowing him space to work at his own pace. Others saw only a difficult boy who would not conform, who challenged authority not through rebellion but through indifference, who seemed to believe that the rules applied to everyone except himself. His mathematics teacher, a man named Epperson, understood that Alan was exceptional, but even Epperson could not always follow where Alan's mind led. Alan's mother, Ethel, received regular reports from the school and they troubled her. She wanted her son to succeed, to fit in, to become the sort of man who could navigate society with ease and take his place among the respectable classes. She wrote him long letters filled with advice and encouragement and gentle reproach. She urged him to work harder at his handwriting, to pay attention to his appearance, to make friends and join in school activities. Alan read these letters dutifully and changed nothing. The distance between mother and son was not hostility but incomprehension. Ethel loved Alan, but she did not understand him. She could not see what he saw, could not follow the paths his mind travelled. She wanted him to be happy, but happiness for her meant social acceptance and conventional success. For Alan, happiness was a solved problem, an elegant proof, a long walk alone through the countryside where he could think without interruption. In his second year at Sherborne, something changed. Alan met a boy named Christopher Morecambe. Christopher was a year ahead of Alan, a scholar and scientist, brilliant in mathematics and passionate about astronomy and physics. He was everything Alan was not: confident, articulate, charming, popular. He excelled in all subjects, moved easily through social situations, and was admired by masters and boys alike. He should have had nothing in common with the awkward solitary boy who barely spoke in class. But Christopher saw something in Alan that others missed. He recognised a kindred mind, someone who understood the beauty of mathematics, who cared about ideas more than appearances, who thought deeply about the nature of reality. They became friends. For Alan, this friendship was transformative. For the first time in his life, he had someone to talk to, someone who understood him, someone who shared his interests and met him as an equal. They worked on problems together, discussed scientific papers, corresponded during holidays. Christopher encouraged Alan, challenged him, made him feel less alone. In Christopher's presence, Alan was almost happy. The friendship deepened over the terms. Alan admired Christopher with an intensity that went beyond intellectual respect. Christopher represented everything Alan longed to be: brilliant but accepted, passionate but poised, living fully in the world while still devoted to the life of the mind. Alan had never felt this way before. The emotion was new, overwhelming, inarticulate. He did not have words for it. He only knew that when he was with Christopher, the world seemed less grey, less cold, less indifferent. They planned their futures together. Christopher would go to Cambridge to study natural sciences. Alan would follow, would pursue mathematics, would perhaps work alongside Christopher in research. The future stretched before them, full of problems to solve and discoveries to make. For once, Alan could imagine a life that was not solitary, a life where his strangeness might be understood, where he might belong. But Christopher Morecambe was ill. He had contracted bovine tuberculosis from drinking infected milk as a child. The disease had damaged his body, though he bore it without complaint. He continued his studies, continued to excel, gave no sign that anything was wrong. In the winter of 1929, he fell sick with complications. He was sent home to recover. Alan wrote him letters, eager and anxious, waiting for news. On February 13th, 1930, Christopher Morecambe died. He was 18 years old. Alan Turing received the news at school. The headmaster called him to his study and told him gently. Alan did not cry. He stood very still, listening, and then returned to his house. He went to his room and closed the door. The other boys avoided him. They did not know what to say, and Alan did not invite conversation. He moved through the following days like a sleepwalker, attending classes, eating meals, saying nothing. The loss was absolute. Christopher had been the one person who understood him, the one friend who made him feel less alone. And now Christopher was gone, and Alan was alone again, more alone than he had ever been. Because now he knew what it was to not be alone, and the contrast was unbearable. He did not speak of his grief. He buried it deep, turned it into something hard and silent. But he did not let go of Christopher. He kept Christopher's memory like a talisman, a reminder that connection was possible, that someone had seen him and valued him. He threw himself into his work with new intensity, as if by solving problems he could somehow honour Christopher's memory, could prove that the brilliance Christopher had recognised in him was real. The remaining years at Sherborne passed in a haze. Alan worked harder than ever, preparing for the scholarship examinations for Cambridge. He won a place at King's College, one of the most prestigious colleges in the university, to study mathematics. He left Sherborne in the summer of 1931 without regret. The school had given him nothing but the friendship of Christopher Morecambe, and Christopher was gone. But the friendship had changed him. It had shown him that he was capable of connection, of feeling, of love. It had also shown him the cost of such connection. Alan Turing would never forget Christopher Morecambe, would carry the memory of that friendship through all the years to come. And in the quiet of his work, in the solitude of his thoughts, he would sometimes wonder if the problems he solved, the machines he built, the questions he asked, were attempts to speak to a friend who could no longer answer. Chapter 4. Christopher. The months after Christopher Morecambe's death were marked by silence. Alan returned to school for the spring term and moved through his days with mechanical precision. He attended classes, completed assignments, sat for examinations. To the casual observer he seemed unchanged, merely his usual quiet self, but inside he was hollow. The world had lost its colour. Mathematics, which had always been a source of joy and fascination, became a duty, a way to occupy his mind so that it would not turn to the absence that filled everything. He wrote to Christopher's mother, Mrs. Morecambe. The letter was careful, formal, full of the condolences one offers in such circumstances. But beneath the formality was a raw need to stay connected to Christopher in any way possible. Mrs. Morecambe wrote back, gracious and kind. She invited Alan to visit, to see Christopher's room, to take any of Christopher's books or papers that might be useful to him. Alan accepted. During the Easter holiday, he travelled to the Morecambe family home in Bromsgrove. The visit was both comfort and torment. Walking through Christopher's room, seeing his books on the shelves, his notebooks filled with careful calculations, his telescope by the window, Alan felt Christopher's presence so strongly it hurt. Mrs. Morecambe talked about her son, shared stories, showed Alan photographs. She grieved openly, and Alan envied her that openness. He could not cry. He could not speak about what he felt. He could only listen and nod and accept the books Mrs. Morecambe pressed into his hands. Books Christopher had loved, books they had discussed, books that now belonged to Alan because Christopher would never read them again. He left Bromsgrove carrying Christopher's copy of Einstein's work, a calculus textbook annotated in Christopher's neat handwriting, and a photograph. The photograph showed Christopher in his school uniform, smiling slightly, looking directly at the camera. Alan kept it for the rest of his life. Back at Sherborne, he tried to make sense of what had happened. Death was not new to him in theory. The Great War had taken millions, and the casualty lists had been read in chapel every week during his childhood. But this was different. This was personal. This was the loss of the one person who had made life feel less lonely, the one friend who had seen him clearly and liked what he saw. In his grief, Alan turned to questions of science and philosophy. If Christopher was gone, what did that mean? The body was dead, yes, but what of the mind? What of consciousness, thought? The sense of self that had made Christopher who he was? Could it simply vanish? Or was there some way in which the patterns that constituted a person might persist, might exist in some form beyond death? He was not religious, despite the compulsory chapel services at Sherborne. The God of Christianity seemed arbitrary and distant, a being who offered comfort without evidence, who demanded faith without reason. Alan could not accept faith as a substitute for understanding, but he was drawn to the idea that consciousness might be explicable in material terms, that the mind might be understood as a kind of machine, a biological computer running patterns and processes. If that were true, then perhaps those patterns could be preserved, recorded, somehow continued even after the body that housed them ceased to function. These were not common thoughts for an 18-year-old boy in 1930. They were the thoughts of someone trying to make sense of loss without the consolations of religion, someone who instinctively turned to science and logic when faced with the incomprehensible. Alan did not arrive at answers. He was too young, too uncertain, too overwhelmed by grief. But the questions stayed with him. They became part of the architecture of his mind, shaping the problems he would pursue in the years ahead. He wrote to Mrs. Morecombe regularly through that spring and summer. The correspondence was a lifeline, a way to keep Christopher alive in memory, to talk about him, to process the grief that he could not express to anyone else. Mrs. Morecombe responded with warmth and patience, treating Alan as a friend, someone who had loved her son and was mourning him as deeply as she was. In her letters she included Christopher's thoughts on various subjects, excerpts from his diaries, descriptions of his interests and plans. She helped Alan build a memorial in his mind, a Christopher who could never be forgotten. By the time Alan left Sherborne for the last time in the summer of 1931, he had made a kind of peace with the loss. Christopher was gone, but the influence of that friendship remained. It had shown Alan that he was capable of connection, that his strange, solitary mind could be understood and valued by another person. It had also shown him the cost of caring, the vulnerability that came with letting someone in. He would never be careless with his heart again. He would protect himself through solitude, through work, through the pursuit of problems that could be solved with logic rather than emotion. But he would also carry Christopher with him, a quiet presence at the back of his mind, a standard of excellence and curiosity and fearless intelligence. When he worked on problems, he sometimes imagined explaining them to Christopher, testing his ideas against the sharp, sympathetic mind of his friend. When he doubted himself, he remembered that Christopher had believed in him, had seen his potential and encouraged him to pursue it. The friendship, brief as it had been, became the foundation of everything that followed. Alan Turing arrived at Cambridge in the autumn of 1931, 19 years old, carrying a grief he would never fully name, and a determination to live up to the promise Christopher Morecombe had seen in him. The world was in turmoil, economic collapse, political extremism, the old order crumbling across Europe. But in Cambridge, in the ancient courts and libraries of King's College, Alan found a refuge. Here mathematics was not a strange obsession but a respected discipline. Here he could think without apology, could pursue questions without having to justify his interest. Here he could begin to build a life. The shadows did not leave him. Grief does not vanish, it only becomes familiar, a weight one learns to carry. But in Cambridge, amid the other brilliant, odd, passionate students and scholars, Alan Turing began to discover who he might become. The boy who had ridden 60 miles alone on a bicycle, the boy who had loved a friend and lost him, was beginning to transform into the man who would change the world. Chapter 5, Loss and Mathematics. Cambridge in the early 1930s was a world unto itself, a collection of ancient colleges and narrow lanes where centuries of scholarship had left their mark in stone and tradition. King's College, where Alan Turing arrived in October 1931, was among the most beautiful. Its chapel a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, its fellows a community of some of the finest minds in Britain. For a boy who had spent his school years feeling out of place, Cambridge offered something rare, the possibility of belonging. The undergraduate course in mathematics at Cambridge was rigorous and intense. Students worked through a curriculum that covered pure mathematics, applied mathematics, and theoretical physics, preparing for the examinations known as the mathematical troipos. The pace was demanding, the standards high. Many students struggled. Alan did not. He moved through this material with ease, often bored by the routine problems, eager to reach the more difficult and abstract questions that lay beyond the basic syllabus. He attended lectures irregularly, preferring to work alone in his rooms or in the college library. He found the formal presentations of material too slow, too repetitive. He could read a textbook faster than a lecturer could cover the same ground, and he resented the hours spent sitting in halls listening to things he had already understood. His tutors noticed his absences but did not press the matter. His work was always completed, always correct, often showing insights that went beyond what had been asked. In his rooms at King's, Alan created a private world. He kept his space cluttered with papers, books, mechanical odds and ends. He liked to tinker, to take things apart and reassemble them, to understand how devices functioned. He built small machines, experimented with electrical circuits, tried to construct a typewriter from scratch. These practical pursuits were not separate from his theoretical work. They were extensions of it, ways of thinking about problems with his hands as well as his mind. He made few friends at first. The social life of Cambridge, with its clubs and societies and formal dinners, held little appeal. He was not good at small talk, not interested in gossip or politics or the theatrical productions that absorbed many of his peers. He preferred long solitary walks along the River Cam, where he could think without interruption, or evenings spent reading mathematics papers and working through problems that intrigued him. But Cambridge was also a place of intellectual ferment. The mathematics faculty included some of the leading figures in the field, G.H. Hardy, J.E. Littlewood, and others who were pushing the boundaries of pure mathematics. The philosophical implications of recent work in logic and the foundations of mathematics were being debated in common rooms and lecture halls. Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead's Principia Mathematica had attempted to ground all of mathematics in logic, and the effort had raised profound questions about the nature of mathematical truth, the limits of proof, and the relationship between symbols and reality. Alan absorbed these debates. He read widely in mathematical logic, in the philosophy of mathematics, in the emerging field of metamathematics that treated mathematical systems themselves as objects of study. He learned about the work of Kurt Gödel, the young Austrian logician who had recently proved that any sufficiently powerful mathematical system must contain statements that are true but unprovable within that system. Gödel's incompleteness theorem shook the foundations of mathematics, suggesting that the quest for absolute certainty in mathematics might be impossible. These ideas fascinated Alan. They suggested that mathematics was more mysterious, more open-ended than the neat proofs and elegant solutions he had learned in school. They pointed toward deep questions about computation, about what could be proven and what could be known, about the limits of logical systems. Alan began to think about these questions in his own way, to turn them over in his mind, to look for angles of approach that others might have missed. In his second year at Cambridge, he took courses in quantum mechanics and the foundations of physics. Here too he found questions that resonated. Quantum mechanics, still new and unsettling, described a world where particles behaved in ways that defied classical logic, where observation affected outcome, where probability replaced certainty. The implications were strange and beautiful. Alan liked strangeness. He liked problems that did not have easy answers, that required new ways of thinking. He also began to engage more with his peers. Cambridge was full of young men like him, brilliant, eccentric, devoted to ideas. He joined the Moral Sciences Club, a society where philosophers and mathematicians met to discuss logic, language, and the nature of knowledge. He attended lectures by Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher who argued that many philosophical problems arose from confusions about language, that clarity required stripping away ambiguity and understanding how words actually functioned. Alan found Wittgenstein difficult, often frustrating, but stimulating. The discussions forced him to think about how he communicated ideas, how he translated the clear patterns in his mind into words that others could understand. Slowly, he built a small circle of acquaintances, other mathematicians, a few scientists, people who appreciated his dry humour and his intense focus. He was never the centre of attention, never the charismatic figure who drew crowds, but he was respected. His abilities were obvious to anyone who worked with him. He was the person you went to when you were stuck on a problem, when you needed someone who could see past the obvious and find the hidden structure beneath. He also discovered that his feelings, the feelings that had overwhelmed him when Christopher died, had not disappeared. He was attracted to men, not women. This was not something he could talk about openly. Homosexuality was illegal in Britain, classified as gross indecency and punishable by imprisonment. The law was enforced unevenly, but the social stigma was absolute. To be discovered was to be ruined, to lose position, reputation, livelihood. Most men who felt as Alan did lived in secrecy, careful and closeted, navigating a world that condemned them. Alan did not agonize over his nature. He accepted it as a fact, as he accepted the laws of mathematics or the behavior of particles. It was simply how he was made. But he understood the risks. He learned to be cautious, to guard his privacy, to avoid situations that might expose him. Cambridge was more tolerant than most places, universities often were, but tolerance was not acceptance, and discretion was essential. In 1934, Alan took the mathematical Tripos examinations. He performed well, earning a first, the highest classification. But he was not among the very top scholars. He had been too independent, too focused on his own interests, to dominate the examinations in the way that prize-winning students did. It did not trouble him. He knew his abilities, knew that the examinations tested a certain kind of performance that had little to do with real mathematical insight. What mattered was what came next, whether he would be allowed to continue to pursue research, to contribute something original to mathematics. He was awarded a fellowship at King's College, a position that provided him with rooms, a stipend, and the freedom to pursue his own research. It was more than he had hoped for. At 22 years old, Alan Turing had found a place in the world, a community that valued what he could do, a future that seemed open and full of possibility. But the world outside Cambridge was darkening. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had come to power. In Spain, political violence was building toward civil war. In Britain, unemployment remained high, and the spectre of another war haunted those old enough to remember the last one. Alan paid little attention to politics. He was absorbed in his work, in the problems that consumed him, in the questions that had no names yet but that he sensed were important. He had no way of knowing that within a few years those questions would become more than academic exercises. The machines he would imagine, the theorems he would prove, the ideas he would explore in the quiet of his rooms at Cambridge would become essential to the survival of his country and the world. But in 1934 he was simply a young mathematician, brilliant and obscure, working in solitude, pursuing truth for its own sake. Chapter 6. Cambridge and King's. The fellowship at King's College granted Alan Turing a rare gift, time to think. The position carried light teaching duties, a few supervisions each term where he met with small groups of undergraduates to guide them through problem sets and clarify difficult concepts. But the bulk of his time was his own, to use as he saw fit. He could read, work on his own problems, attend lectures and seminars, or simply walk and think. For someone whose mind moved best in solitude, this freedom was ideal. He settled into a routine. Mornings were often spent reading in his rooms or in the college library, absorbing papers and books on logic, number theory, topology, and the foundations of mathematics. Afternoons, he might attend a lecture or work on a particular problem, scribbling notes, trying different approaches, sometimes hitting dead ends, sometimes breaking through to clarity. Evenings were for long runs. He had taken up distance running and found that physical exertion helped clear his mind, helped him process ideas that were stuck, helped him sleep when his thoughts would otherwise keep him awake. He was not a typical academic. He cared little for academic politics, for building a reputation through conferences and publications and networking. He published when he had something to say, when he had solved a problem that mattered, but he did not churn out papers for the sake of productivity. His mind did not work that way. He needed time to wrestle with ideas, to turn them over, to approach them from different angles. A single good idea, fully developed, was worth more to him than a dozen incremental papers. In 1935, he began work on a problem that had been posed by the mathematician David Hilbert. Hilbert had asked whether there was a general method, an algorithm, that could decide whether any given mathematical statement was provable. This was called the Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem. It was one of the central questions in the foundations of mathematics, touching on the nature of proof, the limits of logic, and the possibilities of mechanical reasoning. Alan approached the problem by thinking about computation itself. What did it mean to compute something? What did it mean to follow a procedure, to carry out an algorithm? Mathematicians used these terms informally, but there was no precise definition. Alan began to imagine a hypothetical machine, a device that could carry out any computation by following simple, mechanical rules. The machine he imagined was elegantly simple. It consisted of an infinite tape divided into squares, each square either blank or marked with a symbol. The machine had a reading head that could scan one square at a time, read the symbol on it, and then, based on the symbol and the machine's current state, perform an action. Write a new symbol, move the head left or right, change to a new state. The machine followed a fixed table of instructions, a finite list of rules that determined its behaviour. That was all. This machine, which Alan described in a paper he wrote in 1936, became known as a Turing machine. It was not a physical device, but a mathematical abstraction, a way of defining computation rigorously. Alan showed that any computation that could be carried out by following a definite procedure could be carried out by one of these machines. He showed that some problems were computable. They could be solved by a Turing machine, and some were not. And crucially, he showed that the Entscheidungsproblem had a negative answer. There was no general method for deciding whether an arbitrary mathematical statement was provable. Some problems were undecidable. This result, arrived at independently by the American logician Alonzo Church using a different approach, established the limits of what could be achieved through pure logic and mechanical reasoning. But Alan's paper, titled On Computable Numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem, went further. In describing his abstract machines, he had laid the theoretical foundation for the modern computer. The Turing machine was the first precise model of a general-purpose computing device. It defined what it meant for a process to be algorithmic. It provided a way to reason about computation itself. The paper was dense, technical, written in the formal language of mathematical logic. It was published in the Proceedings of the London Mathematical Society in 1937. Very few people read it at the time. Those who did recognized its importance, but its full implications would not become clear for years. Alan had invented the theoretical computer, but the world did not yet know it needed such a thing. While working on the paper, Alan had long conversations with a few colleagues who shared his interest in logic and foundations. He corresponded with Church, whose work on the lambda calculus paralleled Alan's work on computable functions. He attended seminars, presented his ideas, refined his arguments. The process of translating his thoughts into words, into formal proofs that others could follow, was laborious. His writing style was clear but spare, stripped of ornament, focused entirely on the logical structure of the argument. He assumed his readers were as comfortable with abstraction as he was, and he did not waste time on motivation or explanation that he deemed unnecessary. In his personal life, he remained solitary but not isolated. He had friends, people he saw regularly, people he enjoyed talking with. He was known for his eccentric habits, his mumbling speech, his habit of chaining his coffee mug to the radiator to prevent theft, his tendency to wear his gas mask while cycling through the countryside during hay fever season. These quirks were accepted, even affectionately regarded as part of who he was. Cambridge tolerated eccentricity in brilliant people, and Alan was undeniably brilliant. He also continued to explore his sexuality, cautiously and discreetly. There were others at Cambridge who shared his inclinations, men who navigated the same dangerous terrain. Relationships were brief, furtive, bounded by the need for secrecy. Alan did not seek emotional intimacy in these encounters. He had learned from Christopher's death that intimacy brought pain, and he was not willing to risk that pain again. He sought companionship, affection, physical release. but he kept his heart guarded. In 1936, Allen was invited to spend a year at Princeton University in the United States, working with Alonzo Church and the other logicians and mathematicians gathered there. Princeton was one of the centers of mathematical research in the world, and the opportunity to work there, to exchange ideas with leading figures in the field, was valuable. Allen accepted. In the autumn of that year, he crossed the Atlantic, leaving behind the ancient quiet of Cambridge for the newer, brasher world of America. The journey was both an ending and a beginning. He was leaving behind the place where he had become himself, where he had found his voice as a mathematician, but he was also stepping into a larger world, a world where his ideas might find broader application, where the abstract machines he had imagined might begin to take concrete form. He did not know yet what was coming. None of them did, but Alan Turing was ready. He had built the tools he would need. Now he would learn to use them. Chapter 7. The Computable Numbers. Alan Turing arrived in Princeton, New Jersey in the autumn of 1936 carrying a suitcase, a few books, and the manuscript of his paper on computable numbers. Princeton was smaller than Cambridge, a town of tree-lined streets and Georgian architecture built around a university that prided itself on intellectual excellence. The Institute for Advanced Study, where Alan would spend much of his time, was a new institution dedicated to pure research, free from the obligations of teaching or administration. It was a place where mathematicians and physicists could think without distraction, supported by stipends and surrounded by others doing the same. The intellectual atmosphere was intense. The Institute hosted some of the most brilliant minds of the generation: Albert Einstein, John von Neumann, Kurt Gödel, Hermann Weyl. Alan was the youngest among them, a newly minted PhD candidate, but he held his own. His work on computable numbers had already been noticed. Alonzo Church, his advisor at Princeton, had read the paper and recognized its significance. Church's own work on the lambda calculus had arrived at similar conclusions about the limits of computability. But Alan's approach, with its concrete image of a machine carrying out computations, was more intuitive, more easily grasped. Alan attended seminars, gave presentations, discussed his work with others. He was not a natural speaker. He mumbled, lost his train of thought, assumed his audience could follow leaps of logic that needed more explanation. But his ideas were so clear, so original, that people listened anyway. He was proving himself in a community that valued only one thing: the quality of one's thinking. He also began work on his doctoral dissertation, an extension of his ideas about computation and logic. He explored the concept of ordinal logics, systems of logic that could be extended to higher and higher levels of abstraction. The work was highly technical, abstract even by the standards of mathematical logic, but it deepened his understanding of what could and could not be proven, of how logical systems could be constructed and analysed. While his days were consumed by mathematics, Alan's evenings and weekends offered glimpses of American life. He found Princeton less formal than Cambridge, more open and egalitarian. People spoke their minds without the layers of politeness and indirection that characterised British conversation. He appreciated the directness, even if he sometimes found the enthusiasm and optimism of Americans puzzling. He made friends among the graduate students and junior faculty, went to films and parties, explored the surrounding countryside on long solitary walks. He also worked with his hands, as he always had. He built an electric multiplier, a mechanical device that could multiply numbers using relays and switches. It was not practical. Mechanical calculators already existed and worked better. But it was a way of thinking about computation physically, of seeing how abstract mathematical operations could be realized in hardware. He enjoyed the process of design and construction, the satisfaction of making something that worked. The connection between theory and practice, between abstract machines and real devices, was becoming clearer to him. Princeton in the late 1930s was a place of relative safety and calm, but the world beyond was unravelling. In Europe, fascism was spreading. In Spain, a brutal civil war raged, a preview of the larger conflict to come. In Germany, the Nazi regime was consolidating power, persecuting Jews, rearming, preparing for expansion. Many of the European scholars at Princeton were refugees, people who had fled their homelands and could not return. The conversations in the common rooms often turned to politics, to the question of what could be done, of whether another war could be avoided. Alan paid attention to these discussions but remained focused on his work. He was not political by nature. He did not join causes or sign petitions. He believed that the most valuable contribution he could make was intellectual, that advancing human knowledge mattered more than any single political outcome. This belief was not indifference, but a kind of faith in the power of ideas, in the long-term importance of understanding the world more deeply. In 1938, he completed his dissertation and was awarded his PhD. He was now Dr. Alan Turing, a distinction that meant little to him but opened doors. He was offered positions, invited to stay at Princeton or to take up posts elsewhere. John von Neumann, one of the towering intellects of the age, tried to recruit him as an assistant. Von Neumann recognized Alan's abilities and believed that together they could accomplish significant work. But Alan declined. He wanted to return to England, to Cambridge, to the life he'd built there. America was interesting, stimulating, full of energy and opportunity. But it was not home. England was home, with all its contradictions and constraints. He missed the quiet of King's College, the unhurried pace of Cambridge, the sense of belonging to a tradition that stretched back centuries. There was another reason, unspoken but pressing. The political situation in Europe was worsening. War seemed increasingly likely. If war came, Alan wanted to be in England, wanted to be available if his country needed him. He was not a patriot in the flag-waving sense, but he felt a deep attachment to England, to its culture and institutions, to the place that had shaped him. He could not stay in America while his homeland faced danger. In the summer of 1938, he sailed back across the Atlantic. He returned to King's College, resumed his fellowship, picked up the threads of his research. The world he returned to was not the world he'd left. The Munich Agreement had been signed, appeasing Hitler's demands in Czechoslovakia, buying time but not peace. People spoke of war as inevitable, a question of when, not if. Alan settled back into his rooms at Cambridge. He ran along the river, worked on mathematics, attended lectures. But he was also thinking about practical matters, about how his skills might be useful in a conflict that was coming. He had no military training, no interest in combat, but he was a mathematician, a logician, someone who understood codes and patterns and systems. If war came, there would be a need for people who could think in such terms. In the autumn of 1938, he was approached by the Government Code and Cipher School, a secretive British intelligence organisation responsible for breaking enemy codes. They had been monitoring the work of young mathematicians, looking for people with the right combination of skills and discretion. Alan fit the profile. He agreed to attend a training course, to learn the basics of cryptography, to see if this was work he could do. It was. The problems of code breaking were, at their core, mathematical problems, problems of pattern recognition and logical deduction. Alan found them fascinating. They were puzzles, but puzzles with real stakes, puzzles where success or failure could mean life or death. He completed the course and was told to remain available. If war came, they would call on him. He returned to Cambridge and waited. The summer of 1939 stretched out, warm and tense. In September, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. Within days, Alan Turing received a telegram. He was to report to Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire that had been requisitioned by the Government Code and Cipher School. His war was about to begin, a war fought not with weapons but with intellect, a war that would change his life and change the world. Chapter 8. Princeton and the Machine. The 2 years Alan Turing spent at Princeton were formative, though not in ways immediately visible. He was there to pursue pure mathematics, to work with Alonzo Church and the other logicians exploring the foundations of computation and logic. But he was also absorbing ideas that would prove crucial when the abstract became urgent, when theory needed to become practice, when the fate of nations hung on the ability to solve problems faster than an enemy could pose them. He lived in the graduate college, a Gothic complex designed to evoke the atmosphere of Oxford or Cambridge. The accommodations were comfortable, the meals communal, the conversation stimulating. Alan took his meals in the dining hall, surrounded by students and faculty from around the world. He was quiet at these gatherings, listening more than speaking, but when he did speak, people paid attention. His ideas had a clarity and originality that cut through confusion. His PhD work extended the ideas in his paper on computable numbers. He introduced the concept of an oracle machine, a Turing machine augmented with the ability to solve problems that no ordinary Turing machine could solve. This was a way of exploring the hierarchy of unsolvable problems, of understanding that uncomputability came in degrees. Some problems were harder than others, and this hardness could be precisely characterized. The work was abstract, technical, but it hinted at something important, that the limits of computation were not absolute but structured, that understanding those limits might allow one to work around them or mitigate them. He also continued his practical experiments. The electric multiplier he built in a corner of the physics building was crude but functional. It used electromagnetic relays to perform binary arithmetic. The relays clicked and clacked as they switched, a mechanical rhythm that Alan found satisfying. He was not interested in building a better calculator. Others were already doing that. He was interested in the principle, in seeing how computation could be embodied in physical form. John von Neumann, already famous for his work in game theory, quantum mechanics, and pure mathematics, took an interest in Alan. Von Neumann was gregarious, confident, a man who moved easily between abstract theory and practical application. He saw in Alan someone with similar versatility, someone who could think about machines and logic and the real-world problems that required both. He invited Alan to lunch, engaged him in long discussions, tried to persuade him to stay in America. Alan liked von Neumann but did not want to work as his assistant. He valued his independence too much. He had his own questions to pursue, his own path to follow. He appreciated von Neumann's interest, learned from their conversations, but kept his distance. Years later, von Neumann would become one of the architects of the modern computer, and some of the ideas he used would echo the ideas Alan had developed at Princeton. But in 1938, neither of them knew that the machines they discussed in abstract terms would soon become essential tools of war and peace. Alan's social life in Princeton was limited but not absent. He made a few close friends, other graduate students who shared his interests. He went to the cinema, watched films that transported him briefly out of his own thoughts. He played tennis badly, but enthusiastically. He ran long distances, training for marathons, finding in the rhythm of running a kind of meditation that quieted the constant churn of his mind. He also confronted his sexuality more directly than he had in Cambridge. America in the 1930s was not particularly liberal, but Princeton, like most university towns, had its subcultures, its private spaces where unconventional lives could be lived. Alan met other men, had brief relationships, learned to navigate the unspoken codes and signals that marked such encounters. He was cautious, but not paralyzed by fear. He accepted who he was and sought out others who accepted themselves, but he was always aware of the risks. Homosexuality was illegal in the United States as it was in Britain. Exposure meant ruin. Alan had too much to lose: his position, his reputation, his work. He learned to compartmentalize, to keep his private life separate from his professional life, to present to the world a version of himself that would be accepted and tolerated. It was a kind of code-breaking in itself, a constant vigilance about what could be revealed and what must remain hidden. The work on his dissertation proceeded steadily. Alonzo Church was a patient and supportive advisor, giving Alan space to develop his ideas while offering guidance when needed. The dissertation was technical and demanding, but Alan completed it on schedule. The defense was a formality. By the time he stood before the committee, his work was already recognized as significant. He was awarded his doctorate in June of 1938. With the PhD complete, he faced a decision. He could stay in America, take up a position at one of the universities that had expressed interest, build a career in the New World, or he could return to England, to the fellowship at King's, to the quieter, older life he had known before. The choice was not difficult. He was homesick. He missed the English countryside, the familiar rhythms of Cambridge, the sense of being part of a tradition that valued depth over novelty. But there was also the growing sense that his presence might be needed in England. The news from Europe was grim. Hitler had annexed Austria in March. The Munich crisis in September brought the world to the brink of war, and though war was postponed, few believed the peace would last. Alan was not a soldier, but he was a mathematician, and mathematics had uses in war. Codes needed to be broken, communication secured, strategies calculated. If war came, there would be work for people like him. He booked passage on a ship leaving New York in July 1938. Before he left, he bought a few items he could not easily find in England. Parts for building more electronic devices, tools, books. He packed carefully, said his goodbyes to the friends he'd made, and boarded the ship. The crossing took a week. He stood on deck as the ship left harbour, watching the skyline of New York recede, then turned his face toward the east, toward home, toward the uncertain future. Cambridge in the autumn of 1938 was outwardly unchanged. The colleges stood as they had for centuries, the river flowed, the students arrived for the new term, but underneath there was tension. Young men talked about joining up, about what roles they might play if war came. Faculty discussed the implications of another European war, the moral obligations of intellectuals, the question of whether neutrality was possible or desirable. Alan Turing resumed his teaching, attended seminars, worked on mathematics, but he also attended that training course in cryptography, learned about codes and ciphers, about the techniques used to protect and to break communications. The problems were fascinating, puzzles that required both mathematical skill and intuitive leaps. He was good at it. He could see patterns, could hold complex systems in his mind, could reason about probabilities and statistical regularities in ways that others could not. And then, in September 1939, the war began. Within days, Alan received his orders. He was to report to Bletchley Park. The theoretical work was over. The real work, the urgent and secret work that would occupy him for the next 6 years, was about to begin. The machines he had imagined at Princeton, the abstract devices that existed only on paper, would soon become real, would become weapons in a conflict that threatened everything he cared about. Alan Turing left Cambridge and travelled to Bletchley. He did not know what to expect. He knew only that he had been called, and that he would do whatever was asked of him. The boy who had ridden 60 miles on a bicycle to reach school was now a man riding toward a war that would be fought in silence, in secrecy, in the hidden places where ideas became actions and logic became survival. Chapter 9. Return to a darkening world. Alan Turing arrived back in England in the summer of 1938, to a country that was preparing for war while hoping it might still be avoided. The Munich Agreement, signed in September of that year, handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler in exchange for a promise of peace. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London waving a piece of paper and declaring peace for our time. Many wanted to believe him, but others, Alan among them, understood that the peace was temporary, that the machinery of war was already in motion. Cambridge resumed its rhythms, but the atmosphere was subdued. Young men spoke less of careers and more of duty. Faculty who had lived through the Great War looked haunted, remembering the slaughter of a generation. Alan returned to his rooms at King's College, to his fellowship, to the life of teaching and research, but he was also listening, paying attention to the rumours and the preparations, the quiet mobilisation of a nation that had sworn never to fight another war, but now saw no alternative. He attended lectures, supervised students, worked on papers, but his mind was already moving toward practical applications. The abstract machines he had described in his thesis were beautiful as mathematics, but could they be built? Could the principles of computation he had articulated be embodied in real devices, devices that could perform useful work? He began to sketch designs, to think about electrical circuits and mechanical components, to imagine how the simple operations of a Turing machine might be realized in hardware. In December 1938, he attended a course on cryptography organized by the Government Code and Cipher School. The course was held in London, in a nondescript building, and was attended by a small group of mathematicians and linguists. The instructors taught the basics of codes and ciphers, the history of cryptography, the techniques used to protect and break messages. Alan absorbed the material quickly. He saw immediately that code breaking was, at its core, a problem in pattern recognition and probability, a problem that could be approached with mathematical rigour. The instructors noticed him. He asked questions that went to the heart of the matter, proposed approaches that others had not considered. He was quiet, unassuming, but clearly brilliant. They made a note of his name, added him to the list of people who might be called upon if the situation deteriorated. The situation deteriorated. In March 1939, Germany occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, violating the Munich Agreement. In August, the Nazi-Soviet pact stunned the world, removing the last hope that Hitler might be contained. On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France, bound by treaty to defend Poland, issued an ultimatum: withdraw or face war. Hitler did not withdraw. On September 3rd, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. Alan Turing was in Cambridge when the announcement came. He listened to the radio, heard the Prime Minister's sombre words, felt the weight of the moment. Around him, the university emptied. Young men left to enlist, to train, to report to their units. The colleges began to close their gates, to prepare for what might come. Bombing raids, invasion, occupation. The world he had known, the world of quiet scholarship and intellectual pursuit, was ending. Within days he received a telegram. He was to report to Bletchley Park, a country estate in Buckinghamshire, on September the 4th, 1939. He packed a small bag, said brief goodbyes to the few colleagues who remained, and took the train north from Cambridge. He did not know how long he would be gone. He did not know what he would be asked to do. He knew only that his country needed him, and that he would serve. Bletchley Park was a sprawling Victorian mansion, surrounded by grounds that had once been gardens and parkland. When Alan arrived, the place was in chaos. Buildings were being erected hastily, wooden huts with concrete floors, utilitarian and cold. Equipment was being moved in, furniture and files and typewriters. People milled about, uncertain of their roles, waiting for instructions. It looked like a construction site, not a nerve centre for intelligence work. Alan was directed to Hut 8, one of the newly constructed buildings. Inside it was sparse: desks, chairs, a few filing cabinets, a coal stove for heat. He was introduced to the other members of his team, mathematicians and linguists and chess champions, people who had been recruited for their ability to think in unconventional ways, to see patterns, to solve puzzles. They were a motley group, brilliant and eccentric, brought together by a crisis that demanded the best minds Britain could muster. Their task was to break German military codes. The Germans used a machine called Enigma to encrypt their communications. Enigma was a cipher machine, portable and robust, that scrambled messages in ways that seemed unbreakable. It used rotating wheels, electrical circuits, and a plug board to transform each letter of a message into a different letter, and the settings changed daily. The number of possible settings was astronomical, billions of combinations. Trying them all was impossible. The Germans believed Enigma was secure, and they were almost right. But almost was not enough. Polish mathematicians had made initial breakthroughs, discovering some of the internal workings of the machine and developing methods to attack certain versions of the code. When Poland fell to Germany in September 1939, the Polish cryptanalysts shared their work with Britain and France. This knowledge was invaluable, but the Germans had since upgraded their Enigma machines, adding complexity, increasing the number of possible settings. The Polish methods no longer worked. New approaches were needed. Alan Turing understood immediately that this was not a problem that could be solved by hand, by clerks working through possibilities one by one. The scale was too large, the time too short. Messages needed to be decoded quickly, within hours, while the information was still useful. This required machines, devices that could test settings and perform calculations at speeds no human could match. He began to design such a machine. It would be called the bomb, though it bore little resemblance to the Polish bomber that had inspired its name. Alan's bomber was a logical machine, an electromechanical device that embodied the principles of deduction he had explored in his theoretical work. It would test possible enigma settings systematically, eliminating impossibilities, narrowing the search space until only the correct setting remained. The design was elegant, efficient, and entirely new, but designing the machine was one thing, building it was another. There were no engineers at Bletchley Park who could translate Alan's ideas into hardware. There were no factories ready to produce such devices. Everything had to be improvised, cobbled together, tested and refined through trial and error. Alan worked with engineers from the British Tabulating Machine Company, explaining his design, answering questions, solving problems as they arose. The process was slow, frustrating, but gradually the machine took shape. Meanwhile, the war continued. German forces swept across Europe. France fell in June 1940. Britain stood alone, facing the threat of invasion, enduring nightly bombing raids. The Battle of Britain raged in the skies. In the Atlantic, German U-boats hunted convoys, sinking ships carrying food and supplies and men. Every day, people died. Every day, the need for intelligence, for advance warning, for some edge in the struggle became more desperate. At Bletchley Park, Alan and his colleagues worked in secrecy and urgency. They lived in the mansion, or in billets in nearby villages. They worked long shifts, often through the night, sustained by tea and sandwiches and the knowledge that their work mattered. They did not wear uniforms, did not carry weapons, but they were soldiers nonetheless, fighting a different kind of war. The first bomb was completed in March 1940. It was 6 feet tall, a mass of rotating drums and wires and relays. It hummed and clicked as it worked, testing thousands of settings in minutes, a task that would have taken human operators weeks. It was not perfect. Refinements were needed, additional features added, but it worked. The impossible had become possible. Enigma could be broken. Alan Turing, quiet and unassuming, had built a machine that would help save his country. He had translated abstract theory into concrete reality, had proven that ideas mattered, that mathematics mattered, that a man who could think clearly and deeply might change the course of history. The war was far from over, but a weapon had been forged, a weapon made of logic and electricity and stubborn brilliance, and Alan Turing was just beginning. Chapter 10. Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park in the autumn of 1939 was a place of transformation, of chaos made purposeful. The mansion itself, built in the late 19th century in a riot of Gothic and Tudor styles, stood at the centre of the estate, its rooms now converted into offices and workspaces. Around it, the wooden huts were rising, Hut 3, Hut 6, Hut 8, each assigned to a different task in the great effort to break enemy codes. The grounds, once manicured lawns and ornamental gardens, were trampled by construction workers and staff arriving from London and Cambridge and Oxford, carrying suitcases and briefcases, looking uncertain and determined. Alan Turing moved into this world quietly, as he did everything. He was assigned to work on German naval codes, the encrypted communications that directed U-boat operations in the Atlantic. These were among the most difficult codes to break. The German Navy used a more complex version of Enigma, with additional security measures, more rotor settings, stricter operational protocols. Breaking naval Enigma was considered nearly impossible, but nearly impossible was the kind of problem Alan found most interesting. He shared an office in Hut 8 with a small team of cryptanalysts. Among them was Peter Twin, one of the first mathematicians recruited to Bletchley, and later Joan Clark, a Cambridge-educated mathematician who would become one of Alan's closest colleagues. The atmosphere in the hut was informal, almost collegiate. People called each other by first names, ignored rank and hierarchy, worked together as equals. What mattered was not who you were, but whether you could solve the problem in front of you. The work was grueling. Encrypted German messages arrived constantly, intercepted by radio stations scattered across Britain. These intercepts were logged, catalogued, and sent to Bletchley by motorcycle courier or teleprinter. The cryptanalysts in Hut 8 would receive stacks of messages each day, strings of 5-letter groups that looked like random gibberish. Their job was to find patterns, to identify weaknesses, to deduce the daily Enigma settings and decrypt the messages before the information became useless. In the early days, before the bomb was operational, this work was done by hand, using pencil and paper and long tables of possible letter substitutions. It was slow, tedious, and often fruitless. Hours of effort might yield nothing, but occasionally there was a breakthrough, a captured code book, a German operator's mistake, a lucky guess. And then the messages would pour forth, clear text revealing convoy routes, U-boat positions, attack plans. These breakthroughs were celebrated quietly, with tea and a moment of satisfaction, before the team returned to the next problem. Alan was not a typical manager or leader. He was absent-minded, inarticulate at times, prone to losing himself in thought mid-conversation. He dressed carelessly, his tie askew, his clothes rumpled. He chained his coffee mug to the radiator to prevent theft, a quirk that amused and baffled his colleagues. He had a habit of going for long runs during the day, disappearing for an hour or more, returning sweaty and exhausted, but somehow clearer, his mind reset. But when it came to the work, his authority was unquestioned. He saw connections others missed, understood the mathematics underlying the codes, could hold in his mind the complex chains of logic required to deduce a setting or eliminate an impossibility. He explained his ideas patiently, writing out equations and diagrams, helping others follow his reasoning. He treated everyone as an intellectual equal, listening to ideas from junior staff and considering them seriously. He created an atmosphere where people felt free to experiment, to try unconventional approaches, to fail without fear. Joan Clark, in particular, became an invaluable colleague. She was brilliant, quick-thinking, unflappable under pressure. She and Alan worked closely, often sitting side by side, working through problems together, each building on the other's ideas. They developed a deep mutual respect. Joan understood Alan in ways few others did, saw past his eccentricities to the clarity and originality of his mind. For Alan, Joan's presence was a comfort. She was one of the few people at Bletchley who knew about his sexuality. He had told her, wanting no secrets between them, and she accepted him without judgment. The first bomb, completed in March 1940, was installed at Bletchley in a specially constructed outbuilding. Alan supervised its operation, working with the Wrens, members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, who were trained to operate the machine. The Wrens set up the bomb according to the day's menu, a set of instructions derived from cribs, probable words or phrases that the cryptanalysts believed might appear in the intercepted messages. The bomb then ran through possible settings, stopping when it found a configuration that matched the crib. This reduced the search space dramatically, allowing human cryptanalysts to complete the decryption by hand. The process was not automatic. It required intuition, guesswork, the ability to think like the enemy. The cryptanalysts studied German military procedures, learned the habits and tendencies of individual operators, looked for patterns in when and how messages were sent. They became familiar with common phrases, nothing to report, weather report, the formulaic greetings and sign-offs that structured military communications. These cribs were the key to using the bomb effectively. Without them, the machine was useless. As the bomb proved itself, more were ordered. By the end of 1940, several were in operation. By 1941, production had ramped up, and bombers were being installed in multiple locations to keep up with the volume of intercepts. Each machine represented a triumph of engineering and logistics, a translation of Alan's abstract design into working hardware. But Alan did not rest. He continued to refine the design, to propose improvements, to think about the next problem. The impact of the work at Bletchley was becoming clear. Decrypted German communications provided intelligence that saved lives. Convoy routes were rerouted to avoid U-boat packs. Air defences were alerted to bombing raids. Military operations were planned with advanced knowledge of enemy dispositions. The intelligence, codenamed Ultra, was among the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Only a handful of commanders knew its source. The information was attributed to reconnaissance or spies to protect the secret that Enigma had been broken. Alan Turing, working in a cold hut in the English countryside, had become one of the most important figures in the war effort. He did not think of himself that way. He was simply solving problems, doing the work he had been trained to do. But the problems he solved saved thousands of lives, shortened the war, preserved the fragile hope that Britain might survive and that freedom might endure. He worked in silence and secrecy, and he would never be thanked publicly. But he worked, and the work mattered, and that was enough. Chapter 11. The Bomb. The bomb was not a computer in the modern sense, but it was a machine that embodied thought. It was 6.5 feet wide, 6.5 feet tall, and 2 feet deep, a cabinet filled with rotating drums, each drum corresponding to one of the rotors in an Enigma machine. When the bomb ran, the drums spun, clicking through positions, testing configurations, searching for the one setting among billions that would make sense of the encrypted message. Alan Turing had designed the bomb to exploit a weakness in Enigma's logic. Enigma was a substitution cipher, but not a simple one. Each time a key was pressed, the rotors advanced, changing the substitution pattern. This meant that the same letter would be encrypted differently each time it appeared. But Enigma had a fatal flaw. A letter could never be encrypted as itself. If the plain text contained an E, the ciphertext would contain any letter except E. This reciprocal property, combined with the mechanical nature of the rotor movements, created patterns that a sufficiently clever machine could detect. The bomb used cribs, probable words or phrases, to test these patterns. If the cryptanalysts believed a message contained the phrase weather report, they could set up the bomb to test whether a particular section of the ciphertext, when decrypted with a given Enigma setting, would produce that phrase. The bomber ran through thousands of possible settings, eliminating those that produced contradictions, narrowing the field until only a few possibilities remained. These could then be tested by hand, and if the crib was correct, the daily Enigma settings would be recovered. Building the first bomb required collaboration between Alan and a team of engineers from the British Tabulating Machine Company in Letchworth. The chief engineer, Harold Keane, translated Alan's specifications into mechanical designs, working out how to construct the drums, the wiring, the relay switches that would control the machine's operation. It was a feat of precision engineering, requiring components manufactured to tolerances of fractions of a millimetre. The smallest error could render the machine useless. The first bomb, named Victory, was delivered to Bletchley Park in March 1940. It was installed in a hut near the mansion, and Alan supervised its initial tests. The machine was loud, the drums whirring and clicking, the relays snapping open and closed. It was also slow by the standards of what would come later, taking hours to run through a single menu. But it worked. For the first time, Enigma settings could be broken mechanically, without relying entirely on human intuition and luck. The success of Victory led to the immediate order for more machines. By the summer of 1940, 3 more bombers were operational. By the end of the year, there were more than a dozen. By 1943, there would be over 200 bombs running day and night across Britain, operated by teams of Wrens who worked in shifts, setting up the machines, monitoring their operation, reporting stops to the cryptanalysts who would complete the decryption. Alan continued to refine the design. The early bombs were limited in what they could test, constrained by the number of drums and the complexity of the menus they could handle. Alan worked with Keane and other engineers to develop enhancements, additional features that allowed the bombs to attack more complex Enigma variants, to handle longer cribs, to run faster. Each improvement required new designs, new components, new testing. It was a continuous process of iteration and problem solving. One critical enhancement was the diagonal board, an addition that allowed the bomb to test multiple hypotheses simultaneously. This dramatically increased the machine's efficiency, reducing the time needed to break a message from hours to minutes. The diagonal board was Alan's idea, a piece of pure logic translated into wiring and switches. It was one of many innovations that came from his ability to see the problem from multiple angles, to think about both the mathematics and the mechanics, to bridge the gap between theory and practice. The work of operating the bombs fell largely to the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens. These women, many of them young and with no prior technical training, were taught to set up the bombs according to the daily menus, to monitor the machines for stops, to record the results. It was repetitive, demanding work, carried out in cold, windowless buildings where the noise of the machines was constant. The Wrens did not know what the machines did not understand the significance of the results they reported. They only knew that the work was classified, important, and that accuracy was essential. Alan respected the Wrens and appreciated their work. He visited the bomb stations regularly, checking on the machines, answering questions, solving problems that arose. He was kind and patient with the operators, treating them as colleagues even though they had no idea what he did or why he mattered. The Wrens, in turn, found him odd but likeable, a rumpled, absent-minded man who seemed to care more about whether the machines were working than about rank or protocol. The intelligence produced by breaking Enigma was codenamed Ultra. It was distributed only to the highest levels of command, with strict controls to prevent the Germans from discovering that their codes had been compromised. Commanders were forbidden from acting on Ultra intelligence unless they could plausibly claim the information had come from another source. Aircraft would be sent to spot convoys before attacking them, even if the convoys' locations were already known from decrypted messages. This deception was essential. If the Germans suspected that Enigma was broken, they would change their procedures, and the entire effort at Bletchley would be wasted. The impact of Ultra was immense. In the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats hunted Allied convoys, decrypted messages allowed the Admiralty to reroute ships away from wolf packs, saving fuel, cargo, and lives. In North Africa, intelligence about German supply lines and troop movements helped the British forces defeat Rommel's Afrika Korps. In the air war over Britain, advance warning of bombing raids allowed defences to be positioned and civilians to take shelter. Ultra did not win the war on its own, but it provided an advantage that might have made the difference between victory and defeat. Alan Turing did not see the direct results of his work. He did not stand on a battlefield, did not pilot a plane or command a ship. He sat in a hut, worked at a desk, scribbled equations and diagrams, consulted with engineers and cryptanalysts. But the machines he designed, the methods he developed, the problems he solved, translated into saved lives and avoided catastrophes. He worked in the shadows, and the shadows were where the war was truly fought, in the silent contest of intelligence and counterintelligence, of codes made and codes broken, of secrets kept and secrets stolen. The bomb was his weapon, a machine built from logic and electricity, spinning its drums through the darkness, searching for light. Chapter 12. Hut 8 and the Atlantic. The war in the Atlantic was a war of attrition, slow and relentless. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, hunting the convoys that carried food, fuel, weapons, and men from America to Britain. The convoys sailed in formation, protected by destroyers and corvettes, but the ocean was vast and the U-boats moved unseen beneath the waves. A single torpedo could sink a freighter in minutes. Hundreds of sailors drowned in the frigid water, too far from land for rescue. The losses mounted week after week, month after month. Britain, besieged and isolated, depended on these convoys for survival. If the Atlantic could not be crossed, the war would be lost. Alan Turing and the team in Hut 8 understood the stakes. Every message they decrypted, every U-boat position they uncovered, translated directly into ships saved, lives preserved. The work was urgent, frustrating, and exhausting. The German Navy's version of Enigma was more secure than the versions used by the Army and Air Force. It used more rotors, more complex settings, and the operators followed stricter procedures. Breaking it required not just the bomb, but ingenuity, persistence, and sometimes sheer luck. The key to breaking naval Enigma was obtaining cribs, those probable pieces of plain text that allowed the bomb to function. But naval messages were terse, technical, full of abbreviations and code names. Unlike the verbose army messages with their formulaic greetings, naval signals were harder to predict. The cryptanalysts studied operational patterns, learned German naval terminology, tracked the rhythms of daily weather reports and routine signals. They became students of their enemy, thinking like German radio operators, anticipating what might be sent and when. One breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In May 1941, the British Navy captured a German weather ship, the München, in the North Atlantic. Aboard the ship were codebooks and Enigma settings for June 1941. These materials were sent immediately to Bletchley Park. For the first time, HUD-8 had a complete set of valid Enigma keys. Allen and his team used this information to decrypt a month's worth of naval messages, learning the structure of German communications, identifying additional cribs, refining their methods. But the most significant capture came later that same month, when the Royal Navy attacked and captured U-110, a German submarine, in the North Atlantic. The crew abandoned the boat before it sank, and a boarding party from HMS Bulldog entered the U-boat and recovered its Enigma machine, codebooks and key sheets. This material was invaluable, providing months of settings and revealing operational procedures that had been unknown. The capture was kept secret. The Germans believed U-110 had sunk with all hands, never suspecting that its secrets had been taken. The intelligence gained from U-110 allowed Bletchley Park to read German naval messages for several months. Convoy routes were adjusted, U-boat positions tracked, attacks anticipated and avoided. The number of sinkings dropped sharply. For a brief period, the Allies had the upper hand in the Atlantic, but the advantage didn't last. In February 1942, the German Navy introduced a new version of Enigma, codenamed Shark, used exclusively by U-boats operating in the Atlantic. Shark used 4 rotors instead of 3, vastly increasing the number of possible settings. The bombs, designed for 3-rotor Enigma, could not attack Shark. Overnight, HUD-8 went blind. The messages continued to arrive, but they could not be read. The sinkings in the Atlantic surged again, reaching catastrophic levels. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. Allen and his team worked desperately to find a solution. They redesigned the bomb to handle 4 rotors, but building new machines took time, and resources were scarce. Meanwhile, U-boats hunted with impunity, their communications secure, their positions unknown. In the first months of 1942, hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping were sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. The situation was dire. Then, in October 1942, another capture turned the tide. HMS Petard attacked and sank U-559 in the Mediterranean. Before the submarine went down, 2 British sailors, Lieutenant Tony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier, entered the sinking U-boat and retrieved codebooks and Enigma materials. Both men drowned when the submarine sank, but the documents they recovered were sent to Bletchley Park. The materials included settings and tables for Shark Enigma. With this information, HUD-8 broke back into Shark in December 1942. The breakthrough came just in time. By early 1943, 4-rotor bombs were operational, and Shark messages were being decrypted regularly. The Allies regained the upper hand in the Atlantic. U-boat losses began to mount as their positions were tracked and convoys rerouted. The hunters became the hunted. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively in favour of the Allies. The supply lines held, Britain survived, and the invasion of Europe became possible. Alan Turing's role in this victory was central but hidden. He designed the methods, refined the machines, trained the teams, solved the crises that arose when the Germans changed their procedures or introduced new complexities. He worked tirelessly, often through the night, fueled by tea and cigarettes and the knowledge that every hour mattered. He did not seek recognition, did not speak of his work, did not expect gratitude. He simply did what needed to be done. In HUD-8, the atmosphere was one of camaraderie and shared purpose. The team was small, tight-knit, bound by the secrecy of their work and the constant pressure to perform. They celebrated small victories, a broken message, a successful bomb run, and endured the frustrations of days when nothing worked, when the messages remained gibberish, when the war seemed overwhelming. Alan was at the centre of this effort, not as a commander but as a colleague, someone who shared the burden, who understood the problems as deeply as anyone, who never gave up. The work took a toll. Alan lost weight, grew more withdrawn, showed signs of exhaustion. He continued his long runs, disappearing into the countryside, returning drained but slightly restored. He found solace in the routine of mathematics, in the abstract purity of logic that existed apart from the war, apart from the death and destruction that their work both witnessed and prevented. He was fighting a war, but he was fighting it with his mind, with machines, with the quiet application of reason to chaos. By 1943, the tide of the war had shifted. The Allies were advancing in North Africa, planning the invasion of Italy, preparing for the eventual assault on France. The intelligence from Bletchley Park, the work of Alan Turing and thousands of others, had made these victories possible. The war was not over, but it could be won, and in a cold hut in Buckinghamshire, a man who had imagined machines that could think was using those machines to help save the world. Chapter 13. Naval Enigma. The messages came in constantly. Streams of 5-letter groups transmitted by German radio operators from U-boats scattered across the Atlantic, from surface vessels patrolling the Baltic, from naval command centres in occupied ports. They arrived at listening stations on the British coast, where operators with headphones transcribed the Morse code, typing out the letters onto message forms. The forms were bundled, rushed by motorcycle courier to Bletchley Park, delivered to Hut 8. By the time they reached Alan Turing's desk, they were hours old, but hours mattered. A convoy's position changed by the hour. A U-boat moved through the night. Intelligence had a shelf life, and it was short. The process of breaking these messages was both systematic and intuitive. First, the cryptanalysts examined the traffic, looking for patterns in the preamble, the unencrypted headers that identified the message's origin and routing. They noted the time of transmission, the call signs, the message length. These details could reveal which keys were in use, which networks were active, which operators might be careless. Next came the search for cribs. The team maintained logs of previously decrypted messages, studying them for recurring phrases, formulaic language, predictable content. German naval weather reports, for instance, followed a strict format and always began with the word Wetter, weather. Position reports used standard abbreviations. Orders to U-boats often contained coordinates in a predictable pattern. These cribs were gold. They gave the bomb something to test against, a foothold in the encryption. Once a promising crib was identified, the cryptanalysts prepared a menu, a set of logical connections derived from the crib and the structure of Enigma. The menu described which rotor positions needed to be tested, which letter substitutions needed to be checked. This menu was sent to the bomb operators, the wrens who set up the machines. The wrens worked in shifts around the clock in buildings that hummed with the noise of dozens of bombs running simultaneously. Each machine was assigned a menu. The operators set the rotors, connected the cables, started the machine. The drums began to spin, testing thousands of combinations per minute. The machine would run for minutes or hours, depending on the complexity of the problem. When it found a possible match, it stopped, and the operators recorded the result. These results, potential Enigma settings, were telephoned back to Hut 8. The cryptanalysts tested them manually, attempting to decrypt portions of the message with each candidate setting. Most were false positives, contradictions that appeared valid to the bomb but failed when applied to the full message. But occasionally, a setting worked. The letters transformed from gibberish into German. The message was broken. The decrypted text was translated by German linguists, analysed by intelligence officers, and distributed as ultra-intelligence to commanders who needed to know. The entire process, from interception to distribution, could take as little as a few hours if everything worked smoothly. More often it took longer, a day, sometimes more, because the cribs were wrong, or the bomb runs produced no results, or the Germans had changed something in their procedures that invalidated the previous assumptions. Alan moved between Hut 8 and the bomb stations, troubleshooting problems, consulting with his team, thinking through new approaches. He was not a manager in the conventional sense. He did not issue orders or enforce hierarchy. He simply worked alongside everyone else, solving whatever problem was in front of him, whether it was a mathematical question about Enigma's structure or a mechanical issue with a bomb drum that was sticking. The German Navy, unlike the Army and Luftwaffe, understood that their communications were potentially vulnerable. They took precautions. U-boat commanders were trained to keep messages short, to avoid routine phrases, to vary their language. The Navy changed Enigma settings more frequently, used additional layers of security, enforced strict radio discipline. Breaking naval Enigma was harder than breaking the other services, and it remained hard throughout the war. There were periods of blackout, days or weeks when Hut 8 could not read the traffic. During these blackouts, the convoy losses mounted. Ships sailed blind, not knowing where the U-boats were gathering. The pressure on Bletchley intensified. Admirals demanded intelligence. Churchill himself asked for updates. But the cryptanalysts could not break what they could not attack. They could only keep trying, keep searching for new cribs, new angles, new ways in. One such blackout occurred in March 1943, when the Germans introduced a new edition of their weather code book. The old cribs stopped working overnight. For days, Hut 8 struggled to find new entry points. Then someone noticed that weather reports, even encrypted, had to contain certain information: temperature, pressure, wind speed. These values followed physical constraints. A temperature couldn't be negative in Celsius when reported from a tropical station. Wind speed followed predictable patterns. By reasoning backward from these constraints, the team developed new cribs, and the bombs began producing results again. Alan was at his best in these crises. He thrived on difficult problems, on situations where the obvious approach had failed and something new was needed. He would pace, muttering to himself, scribbling on scraps of paper, disappearing into thought. Then he would return with an idea, often strange, sometimes brilliant. He proposed testing multiple cribs simultaneously, overlaying different hypotheses, using statistical methods to rank the likelihood of various settings. Not all his ideas worked, but enough of them did to keep Hut 8 ahead of the Germans. The work was emotionally draining. Every day the team knew that somewhere in the Atlantic men were dying. Sailors froze in lifeboats, drowned in burning oil, went down with their ships into the dark. The cryptanalysts rarely saw the direct results of their work, but they felt its absence when they failed. A day without breaks was a day when convoys sailed unprotected, when U-boats attacked unchecked, when the war was lost a little more. Alan carried this weight quietly. He did not speak about it, did not share his feelings. He focused on the work, on the next message, the next problem. But those who worked closely with him, Joan Clark, Peter Twin, the others in Hut 8 saw the strain. He grew thinner, more exhausted, less able to hide his weariness. He still ran, still disappeared into the countryside for hours, but these escapes seemed less restorative. The war was grinding everyone down, yet he persisted. He refined the bombs, trained new cryptanalysts, developed new techniques. He corresponded with engineers about improvements to the machines, wrote reports for commanders about the state of the work, advised on security procedures to prevent the Germans from realizing their codes were compromised. He was everywhere and nowhere, essential but invisible, a man whose contributions were known only to the few who worked alongside him. By the end of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively won. U-boat losses had become unsustainable. The Allies had air cover, better radar, improved tactics, and most importantly, intelligence. The U-boats could no longer hunt with impunity. The convoys got through. Britain was no longer starving, no longer isolated. The invasion of Europe, planned for 1944, became feasible. Alan Turing had been one of the architects of this victory, though his name would not appear in any official history, though he would receive no medal, though the public would never know what he had done. He had fought his war with logic and machines, with patience and brilliance, with a stubborn refusal to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable. The Atlantic was open, and he had helped to open it. But the war was not over. There were other codes to break, other enemies to face, other challenges ahead, and Alan Turing, tired but undeterred, would meet them. Chapter 14. The Quiet War. The years of the war passed in a strange rhythm at Bletchley Park. There were periods of crisis and periods of routine, moments of triumph and long stretches of grinding work. The world outside convulsed. Cities burned, armies clashed, millions died. But inside the huts, the pace was measured by shifts and messages. by the clatter of teleprinters and the hum of bombs, by small victories and incremental progress. Alan Turing lived through these years in a state of sustained focus. His life narrowed to the work, to the problems that arrived each day, to the constant effort to stay ahead of the German cryptographers who were always looking for ways to make their codes more secure. He slept in shifts, ate irregularly, lost track of days. Time became fluid, marked not by calendars but by which keys had been broken, which networks were readable, which crises had been solved. He developed routines that sustained him. The morning run, often before dawn, through the fields and lanes around Bletchley. The hours at his desk, working through intercepts, consulting with colleagues, scribbling calculations. The visits to the bomb stations where he checked on the machines, talked with the Wrens, solved technical problems. The evenings in the mansion or in his billet, reading, thinking, sometimes playing chess with other cryptanalysts who shared his love of strategy and pattern. He was respected by everyone who worked with him, though few understood him fully. He was peculiar, awkward in social situations, prone to long silences and sudden intense monologues about abstract ideas. He dressed carelessly, often appeared dishevelled, seemed unaware of or indifferent to the impression he made. But when he spoke about mathematics, about codes, about the logical structure of problems, his brilliance was undeniable. People listened because what he said was almost always worth hearing. Joan Clark remained one of his closest friends. They worked together daily, often sitting side by side, thinking through problems, testing ideas. In 1941, Alan proposed marriage to Joan. It was an unusual proposal, motivated more by affection and companionship than romantic passion. He told her honestly about his homosexuality, about the fact that he could not love her the way a husband was expected to love a wife. Joan accepted the proposal anyway, valuing their friendship and intellectual partnership more than conventional romance. The engagement lasted several months. They planned a future together, imagined a life beyond the war, but Alan could not go through with it. He broke off the engagement gently, explaining that it would not be fair to Joan, that he could not ask her to accept a marriage that would never be complete. Joan was hurt but understanding. She valued Alan too much to resent him. They remained friends, continued to work together, maintained the bond that had formed between them. It was one of the few deep connections Alan allowed himself, and he treasured it even after the engagement ended. The work at Bletchley evolved as the war progressed. By 1943, the systems for breaking Enigma were well established, efficient, almost routine. The bombs ran constantly, the cryptanalysts knew what to look for, the intelligence flowed steadily to commanders. But new challenges emerged. The Germans began using more sophisticated codes for high-level communications, including the Lorenz cipher, used by Hitler and the German High Command. Lorenz was more complex than Enigma, a teleprinter cipher that encrypted messages character by character, using a machine that looked like a typewriter. Breaking Lorenz required different techniques, and a different team at Bletchley, led by the mathematician Bill Tutt, took on the challenge. But Alan contributed ideas, consulted on the mathematical problems involved, helped design machines to attack Lorenz. One of these machines, called Colossus, was the first programmable electronic digital computer, a device that used vacuum tubes instead of mechanical relays, operating at speeds far beyond what the bombs could achieve. Colossus was not Alan's design. It was built by Tommy Flowers, an engineer from the General Post Office, but the principles underlying it owed much to Alan's theoretical work on computation. Alan visited the Colossus machines when they were installed at Bletchley in 1944. He examined their design, asked questions, thought about what they could do. He saw in them a glimpse of the future, a hint of what computing machines might become. But the war consumed his attention, and there was no time to explore these ideas fully. The invasion of Europe was imminent, and every available resource was focused on providing intelligence to support the operation. D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy, took place on June 6, 1944. The planning for the invasion had relied heavily on intelligence from Bletchley Park. Decrypted German messages revealed troop dispositions, defensive preparations, the locations of panzer divisions. The Allies used this information to deceive the Germans about where the invasion would occur, to time the assault for maximum surprise, to anticipate and counter German responses. Alan and his colleagues at Bletchley knew about D-Day before it happened. They read the German reactions in real time, decrypting messages as they arrived, watching the enemy struggle to understand what was happening, to respond to an attack they had not anticipated. The intelligence was fragmentary, incomplete. War is always chaos. But it gave the Allies an edge, a few hours of advantage that translated into thousands of lives saved. After D-Day, the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion. The Allies advanced across France, liberated Paris, pushed into Germany. The tide had turned decisively. At Bletchley, the volume of traffic remained high, but the sense of crisis eased. The Germans were losing, and everyone knew it. The work continued, but the urgency lessened. People began to think about the future, about what they would do when the war ended, about whether the skills they had developed would have any use in peacetime. Alan thought about these questions too. He had spent 5 years breaking codes, building machines, solving problems that had immediate life-or-death consequences. What would he do when the problems were no longer urgent? He was a mathematician, a theorist, but the war had changed him. He had seen what machines could do, had learned to think not just abstractly but practically, to translate ideas into hardware, to solve problems that required both theory and engineering. He wanted to continue this work, to build machines that could compute, that could think, that could do more than break codes. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. At Bletchley Park, the work continued for a few more months. There was still Japan, still intercepts to decrypt, still intelligence to provide. But the urgency was gone. The staff began to disperse, returning to civilian life, to universities and jobs and families. The huts were emptied, the machines shut down, the files packed away and classified. The work that had consumed so many lives, that had saved so many others, was ending. Alan Turing left Bletchley Park in the autumn of 1945. He had spent 6 years there. 6 years that had changed him, that had shown him what he was capable of, that had given him purpose and community and a sense of belonging. He was 33 years old. The war was over. The rest of his life was waiting, and he had plans, ideas, dreams of machines that could think and problems that had no names yet. The quiet war was ending. The next chapter was about to begin. Chapter 15. Delilah and D-Day. While the work on Enigma consumed most of Alan Turing's attention during the war years, he found time for another project, one that emerged from a different kind of problem. Secure voice communication, the ability to speak over telephone lines without the enemy being able to listen, was a challenge that had not been adequately solved. Radio transmissions could be encrypted using codes and ciphers, but voice required a different approach. The human voice was analog, continuous, complex. Encrypting it required converting speech into something that could be scrambled, transmitted, and then unscrambled at the other end. Alan became interested in this problem in 1942. He learned that the British military was using primitive voice encryption systems that were cumbersome and insecure. He began to sketch ideas for a better system, one that would use electronic methods to encrypt speech in real time. He called his device Delilah, a whimsical name drawn from the biblical story of Samson and Delilah, though Alan never explained the reference fully. The principle behind Delilah was elegant. The device would convert speech into an electrical signal, modulate that signal with a random key generated by an electronic circuit, and then transmit the modulated signal over a telephone line. At the receiving end, an identical device synchronized with the transmitter would use the same key to demodulate the signal and reconstruct the original speech. If the key was truly random and could not be predicted or recovered by an eavesdropper, the system would be secure. Alan worked on Delilah intermittently, between his duties with Enigma and naval codes. He collaborated with a young engineer named Robin Gandy, who had become a close friend. Together they built prototypes in a small workshop, soldering circuits, testing components, trying to get the system to work. It was hands-on work, far removed from the abstract mathematics Alan usually pursued, but he enjoyed it. There was something satisfying about making a device with his own hands, about seeing theory become reality in a box of wires and tubes. The project was never prioritized by the military authorities. Secure voice communication was useful, but it was not critical in the way that breaking Enigma was critical. Resources were scarce, and Bletchley's focus remained on decryption. Delilah remained a side project, something Alan pursued when he had time, more as a proof of concept than as a system intended for widespread deployment. But the work on Delilah gave Alan valuable experience with electronics, with the practical challenges of building real-time systems, with the ways that noise and signal degradation could undermine even the most elegant theoretical design. He learned about feedback circuits, about synchronization problems, about the differences between what worked in theory and what worked in practice. These lessons would inform his later work on computers, where the gap between abstract design and reliable hardware was one of the central challenges. By 1944, Delilah was functioning, though not perfectly. Alan and Gandhi demonstrated the system to military officials, encrypting and decrypting speech over a telephone line. The officials were polite but uninterested. The war was moving toward its conclusion, and new systems were not needed. Delilah was shelved, never deployed, never used operationally. It remained a curiosity, a footnote in the history of cryptography, evidence of Alan's ability to work across disciplines, to move from pure theory to applied engineering. D-Day arrived in June 1944, the culmination of years of planning and preparation. The invasion of Normandy was the largest amphibious assault in history, a desperate gamble to open a second front in Europe, to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, to begin the final push toward Germany. The success of the invasion depended on surprise, on deceiving the Germans about where and when the attack would come, on overwhelming the defences before they could respond. Intelligence from Bletchley Park played a crucial role. Decrypted German messages provided detailed information about coastal defences, about the locations of panzer divisions, about German expectations and preparations. The Allies used this intelligence to craft an elaborate deception, Operation Fortitude, which convinced the Germans that the invasion would target Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than Normandy. German forces were positioned to defend the wrong beaches, and when the invasion came, they were caught off balance. Alan was not directly involved in the strategic planning for D-Day. That was the work of commanders and intelligence officers, people who translated the raw decrypts into actionable intelligence. But he knew what was coming. He read the German messages, saw the preparations, understood the stakes. On the night of June 5th, as Allied forces embarked for France, he was at Bletchley, working through intercepts, watching as the Germans slowly realised that something massive was underway, but could not quite determine what or where. The invasion succeeded. The beaches were secured, the beachheads established, the breakout began. The cost was high. Thousands of Allied soldiers died in the first hours, but the foothold in France held. The Allies were on the continent, and the road to Berlin was open. At Bletchley, the work continued without pause. German messages poured in as commanders tried to organise a response, to move reinforcements, to understand the scale of the attack. The cryptanalysts decrypted these messages as fast as they could, providing real-time intelligence to Allied commanders. The information was invaluable. Knowing which units were moving, which routes they were taking, which defensive positions were being prepared. The Allies adjusted their plans accordingly, exploiting gaps, avoiding strong points, maintaining the momentum of the advance. Alan felt the weight of these days. The work had always mattered, but now it mattered in ways that were immediate and visible. Every message broken, every piece of intelligence delivered, translated directly into lives saved or lost, into ground gained or surrendered. He worked long hours, slept little, survived on tea and cigarettes. He was not alone. Everyone at Bletchley felt the pressure, the sense that they were part of something historic, something that would determine the shape of the world. By the end of summer 1944, the Allies had liberated Paris and were pushing into Belgium and the Netherlands. The German army was in retreat, disorganised, struggling to regroup. The war was not over. Germany would fight on for another 9 months, and the final battles would be brutal, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies would win. The question was only when, and at what cost. Alan allowed himself to think about the future. The war had defined his life for 5 years, but it would not last forever. What would he do afterward? He wanted to build computers, real computers, machines that could do more than break codes. He wanted to explore the questions he had set aside, questions about intelligence and consciousness and the nature of thought. He wanted to continue the work he had begun at Princeton, the theoretical exploration of what machines could and could not do. But first, the war had to be won, and so he returned to his desk, to the intercepts and the bombs and the endless stream of encrypted messages. He worked, and the work mattered, and that was enough. The future could wait. Chapter 16. Victory and Silence. The war ended in stages, in different theatres, at different times. In May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the war in Europe was over. In August, after the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered, and the Second World War came to its end. 6 years of conflict, tens of millions dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, the political map of the world redrawn. The Allies had won, but the cost had been almost unimaginable. At Bletchley Park, the work wound down gradually. There were still intercepts to process, still intelligence to gather from occupied Germany, still operations in the Pacific until Japan's surrender. But the urgency was gone. The staff, which had numbered thousands at its peak, began to disperse. People returned to their previous lives, to universities and businesses and families. The huts were emptied, the files packed into crates and locked away, the machines shut down or disassembled. Alan Turing remained at Bletchley through the summer of 1945, tying up loose ends, writing reports, consulting on what should be done with the vast archive of decrypted messages and technical documentation. The work at Bletchley was classified at the highest level. Those who had worked there were required to sign the Official Secrets Act, which forbade them from discussing anything they had done during the war. The secrecy was absolute. For decades, the public would not know that Enigma had been broken, that Bletchley Park had existed, that thousands of people had fought the war with mathematics and machines. This secrecy was a burden. Alan had spent 6 years solving some of the most important problems of the war, had made contributions that saved countless lives, had helped to shorten the conflict by months or years. But he could not speak about it. He could not tell his friends what he had done, could not publish papers about his work, could not claim credit for his achievements. The world would not know. His own mother would not know. He accepted this. He understood the reasons for secrecy. If the Germans or the Soviets learned that Enigma had been broken, they might realize that their own codes were vulnerable, might change their systems in ways that would render years of British intelligence work useless. The secret had to be kept, even in peacetime. But the silence was isolating. So much of his life, so much of his identity was locked away, inaccessible, unspeakable. In the autumn of 1945, Alan left Bletchley Park for the last time. He was offered a position at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington near London to work on the design of a new kind of computing machine. The NPL wanted to build a large-scale electronic computer, a machine that could perform complex calculations for scientific and engineering purposes. Alan was one of the few people in Britain with the theoretical knowledge and practical experience to lead such a project. He accepted the position and moved to London. The transition from war to peace was disorienting. For 6 years, his life had been defined by urgency and purpose, by problems that had to be solved now, by work that mattered in immediate and tangible ways. Now the urgency was gone. The problems he would work on at the NPL were interesting, important even, but they lacked the existential stakes of the war. He was no longer fighting for survival. He was simply working. The apartment he rented in London was small, spare, functional. He filled it with books and papers, with tools and electronic components for building circuits, with the detritus of a solitary life. He had few friends in London, fewer social connections. He spent his evenings reading, thinking, working on designs for the computer he wanted to build. He went to the cinema occasionally, took long walks through the city, ran in the parks. He was lonely but accustomed to loneliness. Solitude was his natural state. At the NPL he began work on what he called the Automatic Computing Engine, or ACE. The ACE was designed to be a universal computing machine, capable of being programmed to perform any calculation that could be specified algorithmically. It would use electronic circuits, vacuum tubes, high-speed memory. It would be faster and more flexible than any existing machine. Alan wrote a detailed technical report describing the ACE's design, its architecture, its potential applications. The report was brilliant but difficult. It assumed a level of mathematical sophistication that few of his colleagues at the NPL possessed. It was written in Alan's characteristic style, terse, precise, assuming that the reader could fill in the gaps, could follow leaps of logic that needed more explanation. The engineers and administrators at the NPL struggled to understand what Alan was proposing. They appreciated that he was intelligent, that his ideas were original, but they found him difficult to work with, unable to communicate clearly, impatient with those who could not keep up. Progress on the ACE was slow. The NPL was a bureaucracy, bound by procedures and committees and budget constraints. Building a large-scale computer required funding, approval, resources. Alan grew frustrated with the delays, the meetings, the endless discussions that seemed to produce no action. He was used to the environment at Bletchley, where decisions were made quickly, where problems were solved immediately because lives depended on it. The peacetime world moved differently, and Alan did not adapt well. He also struggled with the recognition he could not receive. In late 1945 and early 1946, the press began to report on the development of computers in America. ENIAC, the electronic numerical integrator and computer, was unveiled at the University of Pennsylvania, hailed as a revolutionary machine. John von Neumann published papers describing the architecture of stored program computers, ideas that built on the theoretical work Alan had done at Princeton and during the war. But Alan could not say that he had been there first, that he had designed machines and thought through these problems years earlier. His work was classified, hidden, lost to history. He felt the injustice of this, but did not speak about it. He accepted that secrecy was necessary, that the world could not know what had been done at Bletchley. But it stung to watch others receive credit for ideas he had pioneered, to see the narrative of computing history being written without his name. He consoled himself with the knowledge that he knew what he had achieved, that those who had worked with him knew, that the truth existed even if it could not be told. In the spring of 1946, Alan took a leave from the NPL and returned to Cambridge to think, to recover from the exhaustion of the war years, to reconnect with the intellectual community he had left behind. He resumed his fellowship at King's College, attended lectures, met with old friends. The university was slowly returning to normal, filling with students who had been too young for the war, with faculty who had spent the war years in government service or in uniform. Cambridge felt both familiar and strange, a place that remembered peace, but bore the scars of conflict. During this time, Alan began to think more deeply about the question that had fascinated him since his days at Princeton. Could a machine think? He had built machines that could compute, that could follow instructions, that could solve problems. But were these machines intelligent? What did it mean to think, to understand, to be conscious? These were philosophical questions as much as scientific ones, but Alan believed they could be approached rigorously, that they were not beyond the reach of reason and evidence. He began to write, to sketch out ideas for papers and lectures, to formulate what would become his most famous contribution to philosophy and artificial intelligence. The concept of the Turing test, a way of determining whether a machine could be said to think, but these ideas were still forming, still inchoate. The war had interrupted his intellectual development, had pulled him away from pure theory into urgent practice. Now, in the quiet of Cambridge, he was returning to the questions that had always driven him. The war was over. The victory had been won. But for Alan Turing, the silence was just beginning. Chapter 17. the universal machine. In 1946, at the National Physical Laboratory, Alan Turing was trying to build the future. The automatic computing engine, the ACE, existed on paper as a series of circuit diagrams, logical schematics, and architectural specifications. It was elegant in concept, a machine that could be programmed to perform any computable task, that could store instructions and data in memory, that could modify its own behavior based on the results of its calculations. It was, in essence, a physical realization of the universal Turing machine he had described in his 1936 paper, the abstract device that could simulate any other computing device. But translating this vision into hardware was proving difficult. The NPL lacked the resources, the expertise, and the urgency that had characterized the work at Bletchley Park. Engineers were skeptical of Alan's designs, questioned whether his ambitious architecture was feasible, worried about the reliability of electronic components. Vacuum tubes failed frequently. Memory systems were primitive. The technology needed to build the ACE as Alan envisioned it did not yet exist, or existed only in experimental form. Alan pushed forward anyway. He wrote detailed technical specifications, worked with engineers to solve practical problems, designed components when existing ones were inadequate. He was learning, as he had learned at Bletchley, that building machines required compromise, iteration, patience. Theory was clean and beautiful. Hardware was messy and frustrating, but both were necessary. The NPL management grew impatient. They had hired Alan to design a computer, and years were passing without a working machine. They did not understand why it was taking so long, why this brilliant mathematician could not simply build what he had designed. Alan, in turn, grew frustrated with management. They did not appreciate the complexity of the project, did not provide adequate support, did not move with the speed and decisiveness the project required. In 1947, while the ACE project languished, Alan was invited to give a lecture to the London Mathematical Society. He chose to speak about intelligent machinery, about the question of whether machines could think. The lecture was speculative, philosophical, far removed from the practical engineering work he was doing at the NPL. But it allowed him to articulate ideas that had been forming in his mind for years. He began by defining what he meant by a machine. A machine, he argued, was any physical system that could be described by a definite set of rules that could transition from one state to another in predictable ways. Humans, in this sense, were machines, biological machines, whose behavior was determined by the physical and chemical processes in their brains and bodies. If humans were machines, and humans could think, then in principle other machines could think as well. The objection, Alan knew, would be that human thought involved something more than mechanism, something ineffable, consciousness, free will, the soul. But these concepts were vague, undefined, impossible to test. Alan preferred to focus on behavior. If a machine could behave in ways that were indistinguishable from intelligent human behavior, if it could converse, solve problems, learn from experience, then it made sense to say that the machine was thinking. The internal experience of the machine, whether it felt anything, whether it was conscious, was unknowable and ultimately irrelevant. This argument was radical for its time. Most people, including most scientists and philosophers, believed that human intelligence was qualitatively different from anything a machine could achieve. That thought required something beyond mechanism. Alan was proposing that this distinction was an illusion, that intelligence was a matter of information processing, and that information processing could be performed by machines as well as by brains. The lecture was received politely, but without enthusiasm. The audience appreciated Alan's ingenuity, but found his ideas strange, unsettling, perhaps too speculative. The notion that machines could think seemed like science fiction. Far removed from the practical concerns of mathematics and engineering, Alan did not mind. He was used to being ahead of his time, used to pursuing ideas that others found difficult or uninteresting. He continued to develop these thoughts, writing them down, refining his arguments. In 1948, frustrated by the lack of progress on the ACE, Alan took a part-time position at the University of Manchester. The university had a computing project underway, led by Max Newman, one of Alan's mentors from his time at Cambridge and a colleague from Bletchley Park. Newman had secured funding to build a computer, and the project was making rapid progress. A small experimental machine called the Manchester Baby had successfully run its first program in June 1948, becoming one of the first stored program computers to operate. Alan was excited by the work at Manchester. The atmosphere was collaborative, informal, driven by intellectual curiosity rather than bureaucratic procedures. He split his time between the NPL and Manchester, working on programming techniques, thinking about how to make computers more useful, exploring applications in mathematics and science. He felt more at home in Manchester than he had in London, more connected to the work, more valued by his colleagues. At the NPL, the ACE project continued without him, though it moved slowly. A smaller version of the machine, called the Pilot ACE, was eventually built and became operational in 1950. It was successful, demonstrating the soundness of Alan's design principles. But by that time, Alan had left the NPL permanently, had moved to Manchester full-time, had turned his attention to other problems. In Manchester, he was appointed Deputy Director of the Computing Laboratory, a position that gave him access to the university's computing resources and freedom to pursue his own research. He worked on programming, developing algorithms for mathematical problems, exploring how computers could be used in science. He also continued to think about artificial intelligence, about how machines might learn, how they might be trained to perform tasks without being explicitly programmed for every step. He wrote a paper, published in 1950, titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence. It was one of his most famous works, read and debated for decades afterward. In it, he proposed what became known as the Turing test, a way of assessing whether a machine could be said to think. The test was simple. A human judge would engage in a text-based conversation with both a human and a machine, without knowing which was which. If the judge could not reliably distinguish the machine from the human, then the machine had passed the test. It was thinking in any meaningful sense of the word. The paper anticipated objections and addressed them systematically. Could machines have consciousness? The question was unanswerable and irrelevant. Could machines be creative? Yes, if creativity meant producing novel and valuable outputs. Could machines make mistakes? Of course. Humans made mistakes constantly, and machines could too. Could machines learn? Alan believed they could, and he outlined how a machine might be designed to improve its performance through experience. The paper was brilliant, provocative, and ahead of its time. It laid the groundwork for the field of artificial intelligence, which would not emerge as a formal discipline until the 1950s. Alan was imagining a future that most people could not yet see, a future in which machines would become partners in thought, tools for extending human intelligence, perhaps even entities capable of autonomous reasoning. But he was also lonely. His work consumed him, but it did not fulfill him emotionally. He had few close friends, no romantic relationships that lasted. He continued to navigate the dangers of his sexuality in a society that criminalized it, seeking companionship where he could, always careful, always aware of the risks. He lived in a small house near the university, filled with books and papers and half-finished projects. He ran marathons, achieving times that placed him among the best amateur runners in Britain. He found solace in the simplicity of running, in the physical exhaustion that quieted his restless mind. The future he was building, the world of thinking machines, was still years away. But the foundation was laid. Alan Turing had shown that computation was a universal concept, that machines could be designed to think, that intelligence was not the exclusive property of biological brains. He had opened a door, and through that door lay a new world. He would not live to see it fully realized, but he had glimpsed it, and he had shown others the way. Chapter 18. Manchester and the Baby. The Manchester Baby, officially known as the Small-Scale Experimental Machine, was an ungainly thing. It occupied a room in the university's computing laboratory, a sprawling assembly of vacuum tubes and wires and cathode ray tubes that glowed with a faint green light. It was not fast. By modern standards, it was glacially slow. It was not reliable. The tubes failed regularly, requiring constant maintenance, but it was revolutionary. It was one of the first computers capable of storing both its program and its data in electronic memory, capable of modifying its own instructions, capable of running the kind of flexible, general-purpose algorithms that Alan Turing had described in his theoretical work. Alan arrived in Manchester in the autumn of 1948, drawn by Max Newman's invitation and by the promise of a computer he could actually use. The baby had run its first program in June, a simple algorithm to find the highest factor of a number. The program worked, proving the concept. Now the task was to develop the machine further, to build a larger, more capable successor, and to explore what these machines could do. Alan's role was loosely defined. He was not the project leader. That was FC, Williams and Tom Kilburn, the engineers who had designed the baby's hardware. But Alan was the theorist, the one who understood computation at the deepest level, who could see what the machine might become. He began to write programs, to develop software, to think about how to make the machine useful for mathematical research. Programming the baby was an exercise in patience. There was no high-level programming language, no operating system, no debugger. Programs were written in raw machine code, sequences of binary numbers that specified operations directly to the hardware. A single mistake, a mistyped digit, an incorrect address, could cause the program to fail or produce nonsense. Debugging required running the program step by step, watching the memory contents displayed on the cathode ray tubes, trying to deduce where the error lay. Alan thrived in this environment. The challenge of programming, of translating abstract algorithms into the concrete language of the machine, appealed to his love of puzzles and problems. He wrote programs to perform mathematical calculations, evaluating functions, solving equations, testing conjectures. He developed subroutines, reusable pieces of code that could be combined to perform more complex tasks. He was learning how to think like a programmer, how to break problems down into steps simple enough for a machine to execute. He also continued his theoretical work. In 1949, he turned his attention to a question that had fascinated mathematicians for centuries: the nature of biological form. Why did living things have the shapes they had? Why did flowers have petals arranged in spirals? Why did zebras have stripes? These patterns seemed too regular to be accidental, but too varied to be simple. Alan believed that mathematics could explain them. He began working on a theory of morphogenesis, the process by which biological organisms develop their forms. His idea was that patterns could emerge from the interaction of chemical substances diffusing through tissue, reacting with each other according to simple rules. If one substance promoted growth and another inhibited it, and if the two substances diffused at different rates, then stable patterns, stripes, spots, spirals, could arise spontaneously from an initially uniform state. The mathematics was elegant, a system of partial differential equations that could be solved numerically using a computer. This was a new kind of science, one that would later be called computational biology. Alan was using the computer not just to calculate but to simulate, to model processes that were too complex to analyze by hand. He wrote programs to solve the equations, to visualize the results, to test whether his theory could reproduce the patterns seen in nature. The work was exploratory, speculative, far ahead of its time. It would not be fully appreciated until decades later, when computers were powerful enough to simulate biological systems in detail. In Manchester, Alan's personal life remained difficult. He was open about his sexuality among his close friends, but he had to be careful in public. Homosexuality was illegal, and the consequences of exposure were severe. He sought companionship where he could, in places where gay men met: pubs, parks, certain social circles. He took risks, perhaps more risks than he should have, driven by loneliness and the human need for connection. In 1952, those risks caught up with him. Alan met a young man named Arnold Murray in Manchester. They began a brief relationship, but Murray was involved with a petty criminal, and one night Alan's house was burgled. Alan reported the theft to the police. During the investigation, the relationship between Alan and Murray became known. In Britain at that time, homosexual acts between men were criminal offences, classified under the laws against gross indecency. Alan was arrested. He was questioned by the police, and he did not deny the relationship. He saw no reason to lie about who he was. He believed that the law was unjust, that his private life was his own business, that he had done nothing morally wrong. But the law did not share his view. He was charged with gross indecency. The trial took place in March 1952. Alan pleaded guilty on the advice of his solicitor, hoping for a lenient sentence. The judge offered him a choice, prison or probation, with a condition that he undergo chemical castration, a treatment using synthetic estrogen intended to reduce his libido. Alan chose the treatment. He could not bear the thought of prison, of losing his freedom, of being separated from his work. The hormone treatment began shortly after the trial. The conviction and the treatment were devastating. Alan's reputation was damaged. He lost his security clearance, which meant he could no longer work on classified projects or consult for the government. His friends rallied around him, but he felt humiliated, ashamed, isolated. The hormone treatments caused physical changes. He gained weight, developed breast tissue, suffered mood swings. He endured the treatment for a year, as required by the terms of his probation, and then it ended. But the damage was done. He continued his work at Manchester, continued to write papers, continued to think about morphogenesis and artificial intelligence and the nature of computation. He travelled to conferences, gave lectures, maintained his intellectual life. But the joy was gone. He felt persecuted, betrayed by the country he had served, punished for being who he was. He struggled with depression, with despair, with the question of whether life was worth continuing. In the spring of 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his home in Wilmslow, a suburb of Manchester. He was 41 years old. An autopsy determined that he had died from cyanide poisoning. Near his body was a half-eaten apple, believed to have been laced with cyanide. The inquest ruled his death a suicide. His mother insisted it was an accident, that Alan had been careless while conducting chemical experiments in his home. The truth is unknowable. What is certain is that Alan Turing, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, died alone too soon, in circumstances that remain ambiguous. The world did not mourn him. His death received little attention in the press. His contributions to the war effort were still secret. His work on computers was known only to specialists. He was buried quietly, and his name faded from public memory. It would be decades before the world learned what he had done, before he was recognized as hero, before his persecution was acknowledged as an injustice. But the ideas he left behind, the universal machine, the Turing test, the theory of morphogenesis, continued to grow, to shape the future he had imagined. In his silence, he spoke to generations yet to come. Chapter 19. Artificial Intelligence. The question of whether machines could think had occupied Alan Turing's mind since his days at Cambridge. Perhaps even earlier, it was a question that arose naturally from his work on computable numbers, from his realization that computation was a universal concept, that any process that could be carried out by following definite rules could be performed by a machine. If thinking was such a process, if the mind was in some sense a computing machine, then why couldn't other machines think? Most people, when confronted with this question, recoiled from it. Thinking, they believed, was something special, something uniquely human, tied to consciousness and free will and the soul. Machines were mere tools, devices that did what they were told, incapable of understanding or intention or creativity. The idea that a machine could think seemed absurd, even offensive, a reduction of human dignity to mere mechanism. Alan disagreed. He saw no reason to believe that human thought was anything other than a physical process, the result of electrical and chemical activity in the brain. If the brain was a machine, a biological machine to be sure, vastly complex and not yet fully understood, then other machines, built from different materials and operating according to different principles, might also be capable of thought. The question was not whether machines could think in principle, but how to design machines that could do so in practice. In his 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Alan proposed a practical approach to the question. Instead of asking, "Can machines think?" a question that was too vague, too entangled in philosophical confusions, he suggested asking a different question. Can machines do what we, as thinking entities, can do? This reframed the problem in terms of behavior rather than introspection, in terms of observable performance rather than unobservable internal states. The test he proposed was simple: place a machine and a human in separate rooms, and allow a human judge to converse with both by sending typed messages. If the judge, after a reasonable period of conversation, could not reliably determine which respondent was the machine and which was the human, then the machine had demonstrated intelligence. It had passed the test. This test, later called the Turing test, was not meant to be a complete definition of intelligence. Alan acknowledged that intelligence was a multifaceted concept, that there were many kinds of intelligent behavior, and that passing his test did not necessarily mean a machine could do everything a human could do. But the test provided a concrete operational criterion, a way of moving the discussion from abstract philosophy to empirical investigation. He anticipated objections, and in his paper he addressed 9 of them systematically. The first was the theological objection, that thinking is a function of the immortal soul, which God grants only to humans. Alan dismissed this quickly. Theological claims were matters of faith, not subject to empirical investigation. Science could not address whether souls existed or what properties they had. The second was what he called the heads-in-the-sand objection, that the consequences of machines' thinking would be too dreadful, so we must hope it is not possible. Alan found this argument contemptible. The truth was the truth, regardless of whether we found it comforting. Wishful thinking was not a basis for reasoning. The third was the mathematical objection, based on Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Some argued that since there were mathematical truths that could not be proven by any formal system, and since machines were formal systems, there were things humans could know that machines could not. Alan countered that humans were also limited, that we too could not prove every true statement, and that the limitations Gödel described applied to humans and machines alike. The fourth was the argument from consciousness, that a machine could not truly think unless it had subjective experiences, feelings, awareness. Alan's response was pragmatic. We could not know whether another person had subjective experiences either. We inferred that they did from their behavior. If a machine behaved in ways that suggested consciousness, we would have as much reason to attribute consciousness to it as we did to other humans. The fifth was an argument from disability, that machines could not do certain things, be kind, fall in love, enjoy strawberries, and therefore could not think. Alan pointed out that this was an argument about specific capabilities, not about thinking in general. Even if there were things machines could not do, a claim that remained to be proven, that did not mean they were incapable of thought. The sixth was Lady Lovelace's objection. Ada Lovelace, the 19th century mathematician who had worked with Charles Babbage, had written that machines could not originate anything, that they could only do what they were programmed to do. Alan countered that this underestimated what programming could achieve. A machine could be programmed to learn, to adapt, to produce outputs that surprised its programmer. Creativity was not beyond the reach of machines. The seventh was the argument from the continuity of the nervous system. The brain operated on continuous variables, not discrete symbols, so perhaps its functioning could not be replicated by a digital computer. Alan argued that any continuous process could be approximated to arbitrary precision by a discrete process, so this distinction did not pose a fundamental barrier. The eighth was the argument from informality of behavior. Human behavior was too complex, too context-dependent to be captured by a set of rules. Alan responded that complexity did not imply impossibility. A sufficiently complex program might exhibit behavior that appeared informal, flexible, human-like. The ninth was the argument from extrasensory perception. Some believed that humans had paranormal abilities, telepathy, clairvoyance, that machines could never possess. Alan was skeptical of ESP, but acknowledged that if it existed and was important for thought, it would pose a challenge. However, he doubted its existence and did not consider it a serious objection. Having addressed these objections, Alan turned to the question of how to build an intelligent machine. He proposed focusing on learning. Rather than trying to program all of human knowledge and all of human reasoning into a machine, an impossible task, one could build a machine capable of learning from experience, a machine that started with minimal programming and developed intelligence through interaction with the world. He suggested modelling the process on child development. A human child was not born with full intellectual capabilities. It learned language, learned to reason, learned social conventions through years of interaction with parents, teachers, and peers. A machine might follow a similar path. It could be given basic capabilities, the ability to perceive, to act, to remember, and then trained through a process analogous to education. This was a vision of artificial intelligence that emphasized learning over programming, that saw intelligence as something that emerged from interaction rather than something that was designed explicitly. It was a vision far ahead of its time. The computers of the 1950s were not capable of the kind of flexible learning Alan envisioned. The field of machine learning would not mature until decades later, when computers became faster, memory became cheaper, and researchers developed the algorithms needed to train complex systems. But Alan had planted the seeds. His paper on computing machinery and intelligence became one of the foundational texts of artificial intelligence. The Turing test became a touchstone, a goal that researchers aimed for, a way of measuring progress. His insights about learning, about the importance of training and experience, shaped the direction of the field. He did not live to see artificial intelligence become a reality. The machines of his time were too primitive, the algorithms too rudimentary. But he had seen what was possible, had articulated a vision of thinking machines that inspired generations of researchers. In 1950, Alan Turing stood at the beginning of a new age, an age he had helped to create, an age that would transform the world in ways he could only dimly imagine. He worked in obscurity, published in journals read by specialists, lived a quiet life in Manchester. But his ideas were loose in the world, spreading, evolving, taking root in minds that would carry them forward. The machines he imagined were coming. The future was unfolding, slowly and inevitably, built on the foundation he had laid. Chapter 20. The Imitation Game. The notion of imitation was central to Alan Turing's thinking about intelligence. In nature, imitation was a fundamental mechanism of learning. Children learned by imitating adults. Animals learned behaviors by observing others of their species. Imitation required perception, memory, the ability to translate observed actions into one's own behavior. It was, in a sense, a basic form of intelligence. Alan extended this idea to machines. If a machine could imitate intelligent behavior, could respond to questions as a human would, could solve problems as a human would, could converse in ways indistinguishable from human conversation, then it made sense to say that the machine was intelligent. The internal workings of the machine, the specific mechanisms by which it produced its behavior, were less important than the behavior itself. This was the foundation of the imitation game, the test Alan proposed in his 1950 paper. The game was simple in concept but profound in its implications. A human judge engaged in a conversation with two unseen participants, one human and one machine, both communicating through text. The judge's task was to determine which participant was the machine. The machine's task was to fool the judge, to imitate human responses so convincingly that the judge could not tell the difference. If the machine succeeded, if it could imitate human conversation well enough to fool the judge a significant percentage of the time, then it had demonstrated a form of intelligence. It had shown that it could understand language, could reason about questions, could adapt its responses to context, could exhibit the kind of flexible, nuanced behavior that characterized human thought. The game was not meant to be a complete test of intelligence. Alan acknowledged that there were many aspects of intelligence, creativity, emotion, physical skill that the game did not address, but it was a useful test, a practical way of assessing whether a machine had achieved a basic level of cognitive capability, and it was a test that could be applied objectively, without requiring agreement on philosophical questions about consciousness or the nature of thought. The imitation game also highlighted the importance of language in human intelligence. Much of what we consider thinking is expressed through language, reasoning, explaining, arguing, storytelling. A machine that could use language as humans did would have achieved something significant, even if it lacked other aspects of human experience. Language was not the whole of intelligence, but it was a large part of it, and a machine that could master language would be intelligent in a meaningful sense. Alan's proposal was met with skepticism. Many philosophers and scientists doubted that machines could ever pass the imitation game, at least not in any interesting sense. They argued that the game tested only surface behavior, not genuine understanding. A machine might produce responses that seemed intelligent without actually understanding what it was saying, without having genuine thoughts or intentions. This became known as the Chinese room argument, formulated by the philosopher John Searle decades later, though the objection was implicit in criticisms of Alan's paper from the beginning. Alan's response to such objections was pragmatic. How did we know that other humans genuinely understood what they were saying? We inferred understanding from behavior. We had no direct access to another person's thoughts, no way to verify that they experienced understanding in the way we did. If a machine's behavior was indistinguishable from human behavior, then attributing understanding to the machine was no more or less justified than attributing understanding to other humans. This argument challenged deep intuitions about what it meant to think, to understand, to be conscious. Most people felt a fundamental difference between human intelligence and any intelligence a machine might possess, but Alan suggested that this feeling was based on prejudice, on an unjustified belief in human exceptionalism. Humans were machines too, biological machines, shaped by evolution, operating according to physical laws. There was no magic in human thought, no immaterial soul or vital force. There was only the physical brain processing information, generating behavior, and if the brain could do it, other machines could too. The decades following Alan's death saw slow progress toward machines that could pass the imitation game. Early attempts at conversational AI were crude, relying on simple pattern matching and canned responses. Programs like ELIZA, developed in the 1960s, could simulate conversation by reflecting questions back to the user, but they had no real understanding of the content. They fooled people only because people were generous in attributing intelligence, because they wanted to believe the machine understood. As computers became more powerful and algorithms more sophisticated, the quality of machine conversation improved. Natural language processing, machine learning, neural networks, these technologies, developed over decades, brought machines closer to the kind of flexible, context-aware language use that Alan had envisioned. By the early 21st century, machines could translate languages, answer questions, generate coherent text on a wide range of topics. They had not yet passed the Turing test in its full form, but they had demonstrated capabilities that would have seemed miraculous in Alan's time. Alan would have been fascinated by these developments. He would have studied the algorithms, understood the mathematics, thought deeply about what they implied for the nature of intelligence. He would have asked hard questions. Did these machines really understand, or were they merely simulating understanding? And he would have insisted on clarity, on defining terms carefully, on distinguishing genuine insights from vague intuitions. But he was not there to see it. He died in 1954, when computers were still room-sized machines, when programming was a laborious manual process, when the idea of a machine conversing intelligently was pure speculation. He left behind a vision, a test, a challenge to future generations, and slowly, steadily, the world moved toward fulfilling that vision. The imitation game was more than a test. It was a statement about the nature of intelligence, a claim that intelligence was not a mysterious, ineffable property, but something that could be studied, understood, and eventually replicated. It was a rejection of mysticism, an affirmation of the power of reason and science to illuminate even the most profound questions about human nature, and it was a gift to the future, a way of thinking about machines and minds that would shape the development of artificial intelligence for generations. Alan Turing played his games with concepts and symbols, with machines and logic. The imitation game was his most famous, the one that would carry his name into the future. It was a game about what it meant to think, to understand, to be intelligent. And in proposing the game, Alan invited the world to play, to test the boundaries of what machines could do, to explore the strange and wonderful territory where minds met machines. Chapter 21. Morphogenesis. In the last years of his life, Alan Turing turned his attention to biology. It was an unexpected shift for a man known as a mathematician and computer scientist. But for Alan, the transition was natural. He had always been interested in patterns, in the regularities that underlay the apparent complexity of the natural world, and biology was full of patterns. The spirals of sunflower seeds, the stripes of a tiger, the segmented structure of a centipede. These patterns seemed too orderly to be random, but their origins were mysterious. The problem of biological form, of how organisms develop their shapes and structures, was one of the great unsolved questions in biology. Embryologists had observed the process of development, had watched cells divide and differentiate, had seen organisms emerge from single fertilized eggs through processes that seemed miraculous in their precision, but the mechanisms underlying this process were not understood. How did cells know where they were? How did they decide what to become? How did the exquisite complexity of a living organism arise from the simple chemistry of cells? Alan believed that mathematics could provide answers. In 1952, he published a paper titled The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, in which he proposed a theory of pattern formation based on reaction and diffusion. The idea was simple in its essentials. Suppose a developing organism contained chemical substances, morphogens, that reacted with each other and diffused through tissue, if the rates of reaction and diffusion were different, and if the reactions followed certain nonlinear rules, then patterns could emerge spontaneously from an initially uniform state. The mathematics was elegant. Alan modelled the system using partial differential equations that described how the concentrations of morphogens changed over time and space. He showed that under certain conditions these equations had solutions that were not uniform but patterned. Waves of concentration that repeated at regular intervals, creating stripes or spots or other regular structures. The patterns were stable, persisting even as the system evolved, and they arose naturally from the dynamics of the system without any need for external control or guidance. This was a revolutionary idea. It suggested that biological form was not the result of a blueprint encoded in genes, not the product of some master controller directing development, but an emergent property of simple chemical interactions. The patterns were self-organizing, arising from the physics and chemistry of the system itself. Genes provided the ingredients, the morphogens and the rules governing their interactions, but the patterns emerged from the dynamics, not from explicit instructions. Alan tested his theory numerically, writing programs to solve the equations and simulate the behavior of morphogen systems. He used the Manchester Mark I computer, one of the first electronic computers available for scientific research. The simulations were crude by modern standards. The computer was slow, memory was limited, the graphics were primitive, but they were enough to show that his theory worked, that patterns could indeed arise from reaction-diffusion systems. The paper received little attention when it was published. Biologists were not yet ready to embrace mathematical models, and mathematicians were not particularly interested in biology. The field of mathematical biology barely existed. Alan's work was ahead of its time, a glimpse of a future that would not arrive for decades. But the theory of morphogenesis was profound. It suggested that much of the complexity of life could be explained by simple rules, that the apparent design in nature was the result of physical laws, not of divine purpose or vitalistic forces. It was a deeply materialist vision, one that saw life as continuous with the rest of nature, subject to the same kinds of mathematical description that applied to physics and chemistry. Alan worked on morphogenesis in the last years of his life, refining his models, exploring their implications. He studied specific biological systems, the patterns on animal coats, the arrangement of leaves on stems, the formation of tentacles in hydra. He was trying to build a general theory, a mathematical framework that could explain many different kinds of biological patterns. He was ambitious, impatient, eager to see how far the theory could go. But he was also struggling. The conviction and the hormone treatment had taken their toll. He was depressed, isolated, uncertain about his future. His work on morphogenesis was intellectually satisfying, but it did not bring him peace. He was haunted by what had been done to him, by the injustice of his persecution, by the knowledge that the world did not value him, that his contributions were unrecognized, that his sexuality was a crime. He continued to work because work was what he knew, what gave his life meaning. He ran marathons, maintained his fitness, kept his body strong even as his spirit weakened. He corresponded with colleagues, discussed ideas, contributed to the intellectual life of the university. But the joy was gone. He was going through the motions, enduring rather than living. In June 1954, Alan Turing died. The work on morphogenesis was unfinished. He had planned more papers, more simulations, more explorations of the theory. But the work stopped, and the ideas he had developed remained largely unknown for decades. It was not until the 1970s and 80s that Alan's theory of morphogenesis was rediscovered and appreciated. By then, mathematical biology had become an established field. Computers were powerful enough to simulate complex systems, and biologists were more willing to embrace mathematical models. Researchers found that reaction diffusion systems could indeed explain many biological patterns: the spots on leopards, the stripes on fish, the arrangements of cells in developing embryos. Alan's paper became a classic, cited in hundreds of subsequent studies, recognized as a foundational contribution to the field. But Alan was not there to see it. He had died alone, his work unfinished, his reputation damaged, his contributions forgotten by most of the world. The patterns he had studied, the elegant mathematics he had developed, continued to exist without him, waiting to be rediscovered, waiting for a future that could appreciate what he had done. Morphogenesis was Alan's last great project, his final attempt to understand the world through mathematics, to find the hidden order beneath the complexity of life. It was a fitting end to a career that had always sought patterns, always looked for the logic beneath the surface, always insisted that reason and computation could illuminate even the deepest mysteries. The patterns were there, waiting to be seen. Alan had seen them, and in seeing them, he had left one more gift to the future. Chapter 22. Conviction. The events that led to Alan Turing's conviction began with a burglary and ended with a trial that exposed the brutality of British law toward homosexual men. It was January 1952. Alan was living in a small house in Wilmslow, a suburb of Manchester, working at the university, continuing his research on morphogenesis and computation. His life was quiet, orderly, focused on his work, but he was lonely. He met Arnold Murray, a young man in his early 20s in Manchester. The details of their meeting are lost to history, but it was likely in a pub or on the street, one of the places where gay men cautiously sought companionship in an era when their desires were criminalized. They began a brief relationship. Murray was unemployed, drifting, not well educated. He was very different from Alan, but Alan was drawn to him, perhaps because Murray represented a kind of freedom, a willingness to live on the margins of society without apology. The relationship was casual, physical, without deep emotional connection, but it mattered to Alan because it broke the isolation, because it reminded him that he was human, that he could connect with another person, however briefly. He invited Murray to his home. They spent time together. It seemed harmless. But Murray had a friend, a petty criminal, and this friend learned that Alan was a man of some means, a university lecturer with a house and possessions. In late January, while Alan was away from home, the house was burgled. Items were taken, clothing, a compass, other small valuables. Alan returned to find his home ransacked. He reported the burglary to the police, as any citizen would. The police investigated. During their investigation, they learned about the relationship between Alan and Murray. It emerged that Murray had told his friend about Alan, that the friend had used this information to plan the burglary. The police questioned Murray, and Murray, under pressure, admitted to the relationship. The police then questioned Alan. Alan did not deny the relationship. He saw no reason to lie. He believed that he had done nothing morally wrong, that his private life was his own business, that the law was unjust. He told the police the truth. He confirmed the relationship with Murray. He was honest, direct, perhaps naive about the consequences. Under British law at the time, homosexual acts between men were illegal under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which criminalised gross indecency between males. The law was vague, encompassing a wide range of behaviours, and it was enforced selectively. Prosecutions were common enough to create a climate of fear, but rare enough that many men took the risk, believing they would not be caught. Allen was charged with gross indecency. The trial was scheduled for March 1952. Allen retained a solicitor who advised him to plead guilty. A guilty plea, the solicitor explained, would likely result in a lenient sentence. Probation, perhaps, rather than prison. Fighting the charge would be futile, as the evidence was clear and the law admitted no defence. Allen followed this advice. He pleaded guilty. At the trial, held at the Knutsford Quarter Sessions, the proceedings were brief. The facts were not in dispute. Allen had admitted the relationship. The only question was sentencing. The judge offered Allen a choice: imprisonment or probation, with a condition that he undergo organotherapy, hormone treatment designed to suppress his libido and reduce his sexual drive. The treatment involved regular injections of synthetic estrogen, a female hormone that would chemically castrate him. Allen chose the hormone treatment. The thought of prison was unbearable. He could not imagine being locked away, cut off from his work, from the intellectual life that sustained him. The treatment seemed the lesser evil. It would be temporary, lasting 1 year. He could endure it. The treatment began in April 1952. The physical effects were immediate and distressing. Allen gained weight, developed breasts, experienced mood swings and depression. The estrogen disrupted his body's hormonal balance, feminizing him in ways he found humiliating. He continued to work, continued to run, continued to present a composed facade to his colleagues, but inside he was devastated. The conviction had other consequences. Allen lost his security clearance, which meant he could no longer work on classified government projects, could not consult for the military or intelligence services. This was a significant blow. Much of Allen's work during the war had been classified, and even in peacetime there were opportunities for mathematicians to contribute to national security. Those opportunities were now closed to him. Worse was the social stigma. Allen's colleagues at the university stood by him, but the conviction was public knowledge, reported in the local newspapers. He was now a convicted criminal, a man labelled as deviant, perverted, dangerous. The shame was overwhelming. He had always been private, reserved, uncomfortable with attention. Now his most intimate life was exposed, judged, condemned. Friends tried to support him. Max Newman, his mentor and colleague, remained loyal. Joan Clark, his former fiancée, offered sympathy and understanding. But Allen retreated into himself. He did not speak about what he was feeling, didn't seek comfort or reassurance. He focused on his work, on the problems he could still solve, on the parts of his life that remained under his control. The hormone treatment ended in April 1953. The physical effects gradually reversed, though not completely. But the psychological damage was profound. Allen had been punished by the state for being who he was, had been subjected to a humiliating and invasive treatment, had been marked as a criminal for the rest of his life. The conviction could not be expunged. It would remain on his record, a permanent stain. He continued to work, continued to think, continued to contribute to mathematics and computer science. But the light had gone out. He was going through the motions, sustained by habit and discipline, but no longer driven by joy or curiosity or hope. The future that had once seemed full of possibility now seemed narrow, constrained, devoid of meaning. The conviction of Alan Turing was a crime, not in the legal sense, but in the moral sense. A man who had served his country, who had saved countless lives, who had advanced human knowledge in profound ways, was persecuted and humiliated for the crime of being himself. The injustice was absolute, and the world, indifferent, moved on. Chapter 23. The Last Experiments. In the months following the end of his probation, Alan Turing returned to his work with what appeared to be renewed focus. The hormone treatment had ended in April 1953, and though the physical effects lingered, he tried to resume a normal life. He continued his research on morphogenesis, refining his mathematical models, running simulations on the Manchester computers, writing papers. He attended seminars, met with colleagues, maintained his position at the university. But those who knew him well could see the change. He was quieter, more withdrawn. The spark that had animated him, the playful curiosity that had characterized his approach to problems, seemed diminished. He went through the routines of academic life, but there was a heaviness about him, a weariness that had not been there before. He still ran, still kept himself physically active, but the running seemed less a joy than a necessity, a way of exhausting himself so that he might sleep. His research on morphogenesis continued to fascinate him. He was working on extending his models to 3 dimensions, trying to understand how patterns might form in 3-dimensional tissues, how the principles he had discovered might apply to more complex biological systems. He corresponded with biologists, trying to connect his mathematical theory to experimental observations, trying to find cases where his predictions could be tested. But the work was difficult and isolating. Few people understood what he was doing. The mathematics was advanced, the biological application speculative. He was working at the intersection of fields that barely communicated with each other, trying to build bridges that would not be fully appreciated for decades. He persisted because the work mattered to him, because it was beautiful, because it was a way of making sense of the world. But he was alone in this effort, more alone than he had ever been. In his personal life, he remained cautious. The conviction had taught him the danger of exposure, the cost of being honest about who he was. He did not seek relationships, did not risk further entanglements. He lived quietly, kept to himself, maintained a facade of respectability. But the loneliness was crushing. He had always been solitary, but solitude was different from isolation. Solitude could be peaceful, productive, a state chosen for its clarity and focus. Isolation was involuntary, a consequence of rejection and fear, a wall between himself and the world. He thought about his legacy, about what he had accomplished, about what remained undone. He had made contributions to mathematics, to logic, to computer science, to cryptography, to biology. But how much of this would be remembered? His work during the war was classified, unknown to the public. His papers on computation were technical, read by specialists, not widely appreciated. His work on morphogenesis was ahead of its time, likely to be ignored or forgotten. He had no children, no students who carried on his work, no institution that bore his name. What would remain when he was gone? These were not idle questions. Alan had always been clear-eyed about mortality, about the fact that lives ended, that individuals passed away and were forgotten. He did not believe in an afterlife, did not take comfort in religious notions of immortality. He believed that what mattered was the work, the contributions one made to human knowledge, the ideas one left behind. But he was not sure his ideas would survive. In the spring of 1954, Alan seemed to those around him to be coping, managing, continuing. He was working on a new paper, attending to his duties at the university, planning to attend a conference in the summer. There were no dramatic signs of crisis, no warnings that anything was wrong. But depression is often invisible, carried internally, hidden behind routines and social masks. On the evening of June 7th, 1954, Alan was at home in Wilmslow. It was a Monday evening, ordinary and unremarkable. He was alone, as he often was. The next morning his housekeeper arrived and found him dead in his bed. Near the bed was an apple, partially eaten. An autopsy revealed that he had died from cyanide poisoning. The apple was believed to have been laced with cyanide, though it was never tested. The inquest was held a few days later. The coroner concluded that Alan had committed suicide, that he had deliberately ingested cyanide, that the balance of his mind had been disturbed. The evidence was circumstantial. The cyanide, the half-eaten apple, the method of death, but there was no note, no explicit statement of intent, no clear explanation. Alan's mother, Ethel, refused to accept the verdict of suicide. She insisted that her son's death was an accident, that Alan had been conducting chemical experiments in his home and had been careless, that he had accidentally ingested cyanide while working. She pointed to the fact that Alan kept chemicals for his experiments, that he had a history of being careless about safety, that he would sometimes eat while working. The coroner's verdict, she believed, was wrong. The truth is unknowable. Alan left no note, no final words, no explanation. The circumstances are ambiguous. It is possible that he took his own life, overwhelmed by despair, seeing no way forward, choosing death as an escape from unbearable suffering. It is also possible that his death was accidental, that he was careless while experimenting with chemicals, that he did not intend to die. What is certain is that Alan Turing died alone at the age of 41 in circumstances that remain unclear. A man who had contributed so much to human knowledge, who had saved countless lives, who had imagined a future that we now inhabit, died in obscurity and silence. The world barely noticed. The obituaries were brief. The funeral was small, attended by family and a handful of friends. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at Woking Crematorium with no marker, no memorial, no public acknowledgement of what he had accomplished. The last experiments were over. The work was unfinished. The questions remained unanswered. Alan Turing was gone. Chapter 24, June 1954. The morning of June 8, 1954, began like any other morning in Wilmslow. The small suburb of Manchester woke to an ordinary Tuesday, the streets quiet, the routines of daily life proceeding without interruption. Alan Turing's housekeeper arrived at his home on Adlington Road at her usual time, let herself in with her key, prepared to begin the day's work. She found him in his bedroom, lying in bed, still. He was cold. He had been dead for hours, perhaps since the previous evening. Near the bed was an apple, partially eaten, darkened where it had been bitten. The housekeeper did not touch anything. She called the police. The police arrived and examined the scene. There was no sign of violence, no indication of a struggle. Alan appeared to have died peacefully in his sleep. But the apple suggested something more deliberate. The police knew that Alan kept chemicals for his experiments, that he had access to cyanide, that he was a scientist who understood the properties of toxic substances. They collected evidence, arranged for an autopsy, began the process of determining what had happened. The autopsy confirmed what they suspected. Alan Turing had died from cyanide poisoning. The cause of death was clear. What remained unclear was whether the poisoning was deliberate or accidental. There was no suicide note, no message left behind. Alan's home showed no signs of distress or crisis. His work was organised, his papers in order, his routine apparently undisturbed. But the presence of cyanide, the half-eaten apple, the method of death, all pointed towards suicide. The inquest was held on June 10th. The coroner heard testimony from the police, from the pathologist who had performed the autopsy, from Alan's mother and a few colleagues. Ethel Turing testified that her son had been in good spirits, that he had been working productively, that there was no reason for him to take his own life. She insisted that the death was accidental, that Alan had been careless while conducting experiments, that he had a habit of eating while working, and might have inadvertently consumed cyanide. Others testified that Alan had seemed despondent in recent months, that the conviction and hormone treatment had affected him deeply, that he had spoken obliquely about death and suffering. The evidence was contradictory, incomplete. The coroner weighed the testimony and concluded that Alan had committed suicide while the balance of his mind was disturbed. The verdict was recorded and the inquest was closed. The funeral took place a few days later. It was a small private affair. Ethel was there, along with Alan's brother John, a handful of friends and colleagues from Manchester, a few others who had known him. There was no public announcement, no large gathering, no recognition of what Alan had accomplished. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the gardens of Woking Crematorium. There was no headstone, no plaque, no marker to indicate where his ashes had been placed. The news of Alan Turing's death was reported briefly in the newspapers. The obituaries were short, noting that he was a mathematician and a pioneer in computing, mentioning his work at the National Physical Laboratory and the University of Manchester. Some obituaries mentioned the conviction for gross indecency, treating it as a scandal, a stain on his reputation. None of them mentioned his work at Bletchley Park, his contributions to breaking Enigma, his role in winning the war. That work was still classified, still secret, still unknown to the public. The world moved on, the 1950s continued, an era of rebuilding and optimism, of new technologies and expanding possibilities. Computers began to appear in universities and research labs, clunky machines that filled rooms and required teams of specialists to operate. The field of artificial intelligence was born formally at a conference at Dartmouth College in 1956, 2 years after Alan's death. Researchers began to explore the questions Alan had asked. Could machines think? Could they learn? Could they become intelligent? But Alan was not there to see it. He was gone, erased, forgotten by most of the world. His papers remained in journals read by specialists but not widely known. His ideas continued to circulate, influencing those who came after him, but often without attribution, without recognition of their source. The Turing machine, the Turing test, the theory of morphogenesis. These contributions existed, but few people knew who had created them or what he had sacrificed. His mother Ethel spent the rest of her life insisting that Alan's death had been an accident. She could not accept that her son had taken his own life, could not bear the thought that he had died in despair. She wrote a biography of Alan, published in 1959, in which she portrayed him as a brilliant but careless scientist who had died tragically young. The biography was loving, protective, but incomplete. It omitted much of Alan's life, avoided the painful truths, presented a sanitized version of a complex and troubled man. The house on Adlington Road stood empty for a time, then was sold, then occupied by new tenants who knew nothing of its history. The garden where Alan had conducted his experiments, where he had thought about morphogenesis and patterns and the nature of life, returned to wildness, then was tamed again by new owners who planted flowers and mowed the lawn. The place where he had died became ordinary, unmarked, unremarkable. But the ideas he had left behind did not disappear. They persisted, quietly, in the work of others, in the development of technologies he had imagined, in the questions that continued to be asked. The universal machine became the foundation of the computer age. The Turing test became a goal, a challenge, a way of thinking about intelligence. The theory of morphogenesis became a cornerstone of mathematical biology. The man was forgotten, but the ideas lived on, growing, evolving, shaping the future he would never see. June 1954 was an ending, but it was not a complete ending. Something remained, something that could not be erased by death or silence or secrecy. The patterns he had seen, the machines he had imagined, the questions he had asked. These continued, waiting to be rediscovered, waiting for a world that might finally understand what he had tried to say. The years passed. Decades accumulated. The world Alan Turing had known transformed beyond recognition. Computers, once room-sized machines tended by specialists, became desktop devices, then pocket devices, woven into the fabric of daily life. The internet connected billions of people, creating a global network of information and communication that Alan had glimpsed in theory but never imagined in practice. Artificial intelligence progressed from fantasy to reality, with machines that could recognize faces, translate languages, play games at superhuman levels, converse in ways that sometimes seemed genuinely intelligent. The questions Alan had asked, could machines think, could they learn, could they become conscious, remained open, debated, explored by researchers around the world. The Turing test, though not solved definitively, became a touchstone, a way of measuring progress toward machine intelligence. The universal Turing machine, once an abstract concept in a mathematics paper, became the theoretical foundation of every computer ever built. The patterns of morphogenesis he had described were rediscovered by biologists and mathematicians, found to apply to systems ranging from chemical reactions to animal coat patterns to the formation of galaxies. But for decades, Alan Turing himself remained obscure. His work during the war was classified until the 1970s, when the British government began to declassify materials related to Bletchley Park. Even then, the full story emerged slowly, pieced together from memoirs and archives and interviews with aging veterans. The public learned that Enigma had been broken, that a place called Bletchley Park had played a crucial role in the war, that thousands of people had worked there in secret. Alan's name appeared in these accounts, recognised by those who had worked with him as a central figure, a genius who had made the impossible possible. In the 1980s and 90s, historians and biographers began to reconstruct Alan's life, to tell his story more fully, to acknowledge not only his achievements but also his persecution. Books were written, documentaries produced, plays staged. The story of a brilliant mathematician who had saved his country and been destroyed by it resonated with a public increasingly uncomfortable with the injustices of the past. Alan became a symbol, a martyr, an emblem of the cruelty inflicted on gay men by laws that criminalised their existence. In 2009, the British government issued a formal apology for the treatment of Alan Turing. Prime Minister Gordon Brown acknowledged that Alan had been treated unjustly, that his contributions had been ignored, that he deserved recognition and gratitude rather than persecution. The apology was long overdue, but it came from a different Britain, a country that had changed its laws, that had begun, slowly, to accept and value people regardless of their sexuality. In 2013, Alan Turing received a royal pardon, a posthumous exoneration of the conviction that had ruined his life. The pardon was symbolic. Alan was long dead, beyond the reach of justice or redemption, but it mattered as a statement, an acknowledgement that the law had been wrong, that the punishment had been unjust, that history had failed him. In 2017, the British government went further, issuing pardons to all men convicted under the same laws that had ensnared Alan, laws that had destroyed countless lives, that had enforced a regime of fear and shame and silence. This too was symbolic, a recognition of a collective injustice, an attempt to reckon with a painful past. But no apology, no pardon, no recognition could undo what had been done. Alan Turing died alone, persecuted, his contributions unacknowledged, his life cut short. He did not live to see the world transformed by the ideas he had pioneered. He did not receive the honour he deserved, did not experience the gratitude of a nation that owed him so much. He died in silence, and the silence lasted for decades. What remains is memory. Memory of a man who saw patterns where others saw chaos, who built machines from pure thought, who asked whether machines could think, and then showed how to begin answering. Memory of a war fought in secret, of codes broken and lives saved, of a quiet man in a cold hut who changed the course of history. Memory of a persecution, of laws that punished love, of a brilliant mind destroyed by ignorance and cruelty. The measure of memory is imperfect. We remember what we choose to remember, what serves our stories, what fits our needs. But Alan Turing's memory endures because the questions he asked are still our questions, because the machines he imagined are now our machines, because the future he glimpsed has become our present. He thought deeply about what it meant to think, to compute, to be intelligent. And in thinking about these things, he gave us tools and concepts and visions that continue to shape our world. The past is quiet now. The war is over. The huts at Bletchley Park are museums. The computers Alan worked on are relics. The people who knew him are gone. But the ideas remain, living in every computer, every algorithm, every artificial intelligence, every biological model based on reaction and diffusion. The ideas are his legacy, more enduring than monuments, more powerful than fame. Alan Matheson Turing was born in 1912 and died in 1954. He lived 41 years, accomplished more than most accomplish in twice that span, and left behind a body of work that transformed mathematics, computer science, artificial intelligence, and biology. He was persecuted for being who he was, and he died without recognition, without justice, without peace. But he is not forgotten. The world he helped to create remembers him. The machines he imagined honour him. The questions he asked continue to inspire. And in the quiet hours, when we wonder whether machines can think, whether intelligence is unique to humans, whether patterns can emerge from chaos, we are thinking with Alan Turing, continuing the conversation he began, walking paths he opened. Rest now. The work continues. The patterns persist. The machines think. And the memory of a quiet mathematician running through the English countryside thinking about infinity and codes and the nature of thought remains. It remains because it matters, because the questions were real, because the answers changed everything. Rest now, Alan Turing. The world you imagined is here, and we remember.